I am Leon, 75 years old. My wife Ruby was fighting for her life in the intensive care unit after a massive stroke. I was sitting in the cold hospital waiting room praying for a miracle. My own son and his wife stood just a few feet away. They did not offer a hug. They did not offer comfort. Instead, my daughter-in-law was whispering on her phone, complaining that her evening was ruined and planning to put me in a home. I thought my ears were failing me. Then a stranger, an old preacher in a worn suit, walked past and dropped a crumpled note in my lap. It said my son was in the stairwell planning to pull the plug to cash out our estate. Before I tell you how I tore their lives apart brick by brick, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to fight the people who were supposed to love you the most. There were no sad skies or dramatic thunderstorms that night. Real life does not give you a soundtrack when your world falls apart. There was only the sharp, irritating clack of Chloe and her designer heels echoing on the sterile hospital tiles. Ruby had just been rushed through the double doors of the intensive care unit. Just that morning, she was making breakfast in our kitchen, humming an old gospel tune. We were planning to plant tomatoes in the garden this weekend. Then the mug slipped from her hand and she collapsed. The stroke hit her out of nowhere and completely tore my soul in two. The ambulance ride felt like a blur. 40 years we had been married. 40 years of building a life from the ground up in Atlanta. And now she was hooked up to machines I did not understand. I sat in a hard plastic chair staring at the scuffed toes of my old work boots. Derek and Chloe arrived 20 minutes later. Derek is my son. Flesh of my flesh. He wore a sharp custom suit. Chloe wore a cocktail dress and an expression of profound annoyance. They did not rush over to hold me. Derek did not put a hand on my shoulder to tell me everything would be all right. Chloe stopped exactly 6 feet away from me. She immediately pulled out a bottle of hand sanitizer and rubbed it furiously into her palms as if the hospital air was contaminating her expensive skin. I kept my head down, resting my face in my hands. 40 years of hauling concrete and laying bricks had given me hands that felt like rough sandpaper. I let my shoulders slump. I played the part of the broken and exhausted old man. They thought I was deaf. They thought age had stolen my hearing and my wits. People always underestimate an old black man in work clothes. Chloe stepped a few paces away, but not far enough. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. Her voice was a harsh whisper, but in that quiet waiting room I heard every single word. She told the person on the phone that the old man would not last without her. She said they needed the medical proxy drawn up tonight because she was definitely not changing my wife's diapers. She sighed heavily, tapping her manicured nails against the wall. Then she added that the lawyers needed to hurry because if Ruby made it through the night, the medical bills were going to cost them a fortune. My blood turned to ice. Then the ice turned into a raging fire. This was the woman my son chose. This was the woman who always looked down her nose at my worn-out truck and my calloused hands. I stayed perfectly still. I did not scream. I did not confront her. 40 years of construction taught me that you never swing a hammer until you know exactly where the load-bearing walls are. I was not the only one listening. 3 chairs down from me sat an 80-year-old man. He was a black man dressed in a faded and threadbare suit that had seen better days. He looked like an old-school preacher. He had a wooden cane resting between his knees. He had been sitting there in silence the whole time with his eyes closed, seemingly asleep. But he was not asleep. He had heard everything. The old preacher slowly opened his eyes. He looked at me. There was a deep and silent understanding in his gaze. It was a pure recognition of shared pain. He leaned heavily on his cane and stood up. He did not say a single word. The silence was heavy as he shuffled past me toward the exit. As he walked by my chair, he casually dropped his hand. A small, crumpled piece of notebook paper fell directly into my lap. He kept walking and disappeared down the long, bright hallway. I waited until Chloe turned her back to look out the window. I slowly unfolded the piece of paper. The handwriting was shaky and written in blue ink, but the words hit me harder than a freight train. The note said that my son was on the phone in the stairwell. It said they were talking about pulling the plug. It ended with 3 simple words. Run or fight. My own son, Derek. The boy I had worked double shifts to put through college. The boy whose failing tech startup I had silently worried about for months. I had given Derek everything I never had. When I was his age, my back was breaking under the Georgia sun, pouring foundations for buildings I would never be allowed to live in. I paid for his expensive degree. I watched him buy fancy cars and pretend he was a Silicon Valley genius while his company burned money. I never asked him for a dime. I just wanted his respect. He was not just waiting for his mother to die. He was actively planning it. He was in the stairwell right now, calculating the payout of our deaths. Chloe was drowning in debt from her pretentious luxury spa, trying to live a billionaire lifestyle on a millionaire budget. They needed cash desperately, and they saw my wife's tragedy as their golden ticket. I crushed the note in my fist. They saw an old, tired contractor. They saw a man they could easily push into a state-run nursing home to drain his pension. They thought they held all the cards. But what Derek and Chloe did not know was that I had spent the last decade building a $40 million commercial real estate empire under a blind corporate trust. I was not just a retired bricklayer. I was the landlord of her luxury spa. I was the silent force that could crush their entire world with a single phone call. I took a deep breath, stood up from that plastic chair, and decided exactly what I was going to do. I was not going to run. I was going to fight. And I was going to leave them with absolutely nothing. I crumpled the old preacher's note in my calloused hand. The anger inside me was a quiet, dangerous thing. I did not confront Chloe in the waiting room. I moved silently. 40 years of walking across dangerous construction sites taught me how to walk without making a single sound. I bypassed the nurse's station and headed directly toward the heavy metal door of the emergency stairwell. I pushed the door open just a crack. The air inside the stairwell was freezing cold and smelled strongly of bleach and old floor wax. Down half a flight of concrete stairs stood my son, Derek. He was pacing back and forth in his tailored Italian suit. He had his expensive smartphone pressed hard against his ear. His voice was low and calculated, but the concrete walls echoed every single syllable of his ultimate betrayal. "Yes, the suburban house is in both their names," Derek said into the phone. He sounded impatient. He sounded exactly like a ruthless corporate raider closing a cheap business deal, not a son whose mother was currently fighting for every single breath. I stood frozen in the shadows above him. I listened to the boy I had raised plot my destruction. "Transfer my mom to a state-run facility," Derek continued coldly. "Find the cheapest one in the county. We need to drain her pension first before Medicaid kicks in. Put the house on the market the absolute second I get the old man to sign the power of attorney. He is too tired and confused to read the fine print anyway." I stopped breathing. The pain radiating through my chest was far sharper than any physical injury I had ever sustained on a job site. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle in that very suburban driveway. The boy Ruby had stayed up all night nursing through childhood fevers. He was actively planning to dump his own mother in a dilapidated state ward just to liquidate our family home. He thought I was just a tired old bricklayer who would blindly sign whatever legal paper he shoved in front of my face. I closed the stairwell door silently. I did not shed a single tear. Tears are for the weak, and I could not afford to be weak. I was a man who built skyscrapers from the dirt up. I knew exactly how to lay a solid foundation, and more importantly, I knew exactly how to demolish a structure with surgical precision. I walked back into the bright, sterile waiting room. I kept my posture slightly hunched. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed linoleum floor. I played the part of the helpless, grieving victim to absolute perfection. Chloe was still sitting in the plastic chair, scrolling endlessly on her phone, looking profoundly bored by the inconvenience of her mother-in-law fighting for her life. Derek walked back through the double doors a few minutes later. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and immediately plastered a mask of fake concern across his face. Before he could even say a word to me, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open violently. The head surgeon walked out. He looked completely exhausted. He pulled off his surgical cap and walked directly toward Derek and Chloe, naturally assuming that the young, well-dressed couple were the ones in charge of the situation. I stayed a few paces back in the shadows, watching their sick performance unfold. The surgeon spoke quickly. He said Ruby was temporarily stabilized, but she was not out of the woods. He explained that she had suffered a severe arterial blockage that caused the stroke. She needed an immediate experimental arterial surgery to clear the blockage and restore full blood flow to her brain. He told us it was a highly specialized procedure with a 99% success rate, but because it was experimental, it was not covered by standard Medicare or basic insurance policies. The immediate out-of-pocket cost was $150,000. He needed a definitive answer right then and there, or the window to save her cognitive function would close forever. Chloe did not even blink. She did not hesitate. She immediately stepped right in front of me, completely blocking my view of the doctor. She put her manicured hand over her chest and put on a spectacular, sickening display of fake sorrow. She looked the doctor right in the eyes and sighed a deep, tragic sigh. "Doctor, we are so devastated," Chloe said, her voice dripping with fake pity and condescension. "But they are just retired construction workers. They do not have premium insurance. They barely get by on a fixed income from Social Security. We simply do not have that kind of money lying around. We have to decline the surgery. Please just keep her comfortable and let nature take its course." I looked over at Derek. My own flesh and blood. My only child. I waited for him to scream. I waited for him to offer to sell his fancy sports car, to mortgage his tech startup company, to beg the hospital for a payment plan, to do whatever it took to save the woman who gave him life and loved him unconditionally. Instead, Derek slowly nodded his head in agreement. He looked down at the floor, refusing to make eye contact with me, and told the doctor that his wife was right. They had to let her go. He literally sealed his own mother's fate for a real estate payout. He condemned her to death so he could steal my house. The surgeon looked deeply uncomfortable. He lowered his clipboard and started to say he was very sorry for our situation. I did not let him finish his sentence. I stopped slouching. I straightened my back to my full height. The tired, broken old bricklayer vanished instantly. I stepped forward with heavy, deliberate steps. I walked right up to Derek and physically shoved him aside. I pushed him hard enough with my shoulder that he stumbled backward and crashed awkwardly into a row of plastic waiting room chairs. Chloe let out a loud gasp of shock and backed away. I ignored them both. I reached deep into the back pocket of my faded denim jeans. I pulled out my worn leather wallet. It was scratched, battered, and covered in years of dry cement dust. Chloe sneered at it, probably thinking I was going to pull out a few crumpled $20 bills to beg the doctor for a miracle. Instead, I opened the battered leather and pulled out a solid, heavy titanium Centurion Black card, an American Express card offered by exclusive invitation only. A card you only possess if you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a month and have millions sitting in liquid assets. I slammed the heavy metal card down onto the stainless steel billing counter. It made a loud, sharp clack that echoed like a gunshot through the entire waiting room. I looked the head surgeon dead in the eyes. My voice was completely steady, commanding and cold as ice. "Charge it," I demanded. "Every single penny. And move my wife to the VIP recovery wing immediately. Now." The surgeon stared at the heavy black card in absolute shock. He looked from the card to my worn work boots, and then back up to my eyes. He recognized the tone of a man who was used to giving orders and having them followed instantly. He quickly nodded, grabbed the card with trembling fingers, and sprinted back toward the intensive care unit, double doors. I turned around slowly to face my son and his wife. Derek and Chloe were completely frozen. They were staring at the billing counter in absolute horror. The color had drained entirely from Chloe's face, leaving her pale and trembling. Her jaw was practically touching the floor. Derek was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a chaotic mixture of confusion, disbelief, and sheer panic. They thought I was a poor, uneducated laborer they could easily push into an early grave. They thought they held all the power in the room. They were just beginning to realize that the vulnerable old man they were actively trying to rob and discard was a secret millionaire. And they had just made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of their miserable lives. I left the hospital feeling a strange mixture of relief and absolute disgust. My wife Ruby was resting comfortably in the private VIP recovery wing. The experimental surgery was a complete success. The best doctors in the state of Georgia were watching over her around the clock. I knew she was safe for now. But as I drove my battered Ford pickup truck back to our quiet suburban neighborhood, my mind was not resting. It was calculating. I pulled into the driveway of the brick house I had built with my own 2 hands nearly 40 years ago. The house was dark. It felt empty without Ruby humming in the kitchen. I barely had time to put my keys on the counter before I saw the glaring headlights of a luxury European SUV pull into my driveway. I stood by the window and watched them get out. Derek and Chloe, my son and my daughter-in-law. They had not visited this house on a weekday in over 3 years. They always claimed they were too busy running their highly successful businesses. But tonight they had all the time in the world. I knew exactly why they were here. They were panicking. That heavy titanium black card I dropped on the hospital billing counter had completely shattered their reality. They came here to find out if the old man they planned to rob was actually a gold mine or if it was just a fluke. I opened the front door before they could even knock. Chloe stood on my porch wearing her expensive designer coat. In her hands, she held a cheap plastic container of store-bought soup. It was the ultimate insult. A pathetic, transparent disguise for their true motives. Dad, Derek said, forcing a look of deep concern onto his face. "We were so worried about you. We know you must be exhausted and hungry. Chloe brought you some dinner. We just wanted to make sure you were holding up okay." I looked at the plastic container of soup. It probably cost them $3 at the local gas station. I stepped aside and let the wolves into my home. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same wooden table where I used to help Derek with his math homework when he was a little boy. Chloe aggressively peeled the lid off the soup and pushed the bowl toward me. The smell of artificial chicken broth filled the air. I did not touch the spoon. I just stared at my calloused hands, waiting for their interrogation to begin. It did not take long. Chloe could barely hide her anxiety. "Leon," she started, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We are so relieved about Ruby. But Derek and I have been talking. We are really concerned about the financial burden this is going to put on you. That surgery was incredibly expensive. We saw you use that black credit card at the hospital. We had no idea you had an account like that." Derek leaned in closer. His eyes were wide with a greedy, desperate curiosity. "Yes, Dad," he said smoothly. "We just want to make sure you did not put yourself into massive debt." "Where did a card like that even come from? Are you mixed up in some high-interest loan?" I kept my head down. I let my shoulders slump forward. I knew exactly what they wanted to hear. If I told them I was secretly a multimillionaire, they would change their tactics. They would play the loving children and try to bleed me dry slowly. But if I told them I was broke, they would rush to execute their original ruthless plan. I decided to feed them exactly what they were starving for: a lie. "It is nothing," I mumbled, making my voice sound weak and embarrassed. "It is just an old workers' compensation settlement from back in the 90s. I shattered my knee on a commercial job site and the company gave me a payout. The bank tied that fancy black promotional card to the account years ago to make me feel important. But the surgery took almost everything that was left in it. The account is practically empty now." I watched their faces very closely. The transformation was immediate and sickening. The panic instantly drained from Chloe's pale face. Her shoulders relaxed. She let out a small, almost inaudible sigh of relief. Derek leaned back in his chair, a smug and arrogant look returning to his eyes. They completely believed my lie. They thought I had just blown my last dime saving my wife, and that I was right back to being the poor, helpless old bricklayer they could easily manipulate. "Well," Dad Derek said, his voice instantly losing its fake warmth, "that was very irresponsible of you. You should have consulted us before draining your only safety net. How are you going to pay for her physical therapy? How are you going to pay the property taxes on this house?" I stayed silent. I let them feel like they were in total control of the room. Chloe reached into her expensive leather handbag. She pulled out a crisp, newly printed legal document and placed it flat on the kitchen table. She slowly slid it across the wood until it was sitting right next to the bowl of cheap soup. "Dad, the stress is clearly too much for you to handle right now," Chloe said. Her tone was no longer sweet. It was firm and commanding, like a boss speaking to a lowly employee. "You are grieving. You are confused. You are making rash financial decisions that will ruin you. We want to help." She tapped her manicured fingernail on the bottom line of the document. "Sign this financial power of attorney," she demanded gently. "It will give Derek full legal authority to manage your bank accounts and pay Mom's hospital bills for you. We can take over the management of this house. You will not have to worry about a single thing anymore. Just sign on the dotted line and we will handle the rest." I looked down at the document. I did not need my reading glasses to know exactly what it said. It was a blank check for them to steal my entire life. It gave Derek the legal right to empty my checking accounts, take out loans in my name, and sell the very house we were sitting in. They wanted to strip me of my independence and throw me to the wolves. I looked up at Derek. He was staring at the pen in Chloe's hand, practically salivating. He was not looking at his father. He was looking at his next paycheck. I slowly reached out my rough, scarred hand to take the pen. I did not refuse them. I did not scream at them to get out of my house. I decided to give them a performance they would never forget. As my fingers wrapped around the pen, I began to shake. I made my hand tremble violently. I let out a heavy, pathetic gasp, acting like a broken old man who was completely overwhelmed by sorrow and exhaustion. "Dad, just sign it." Derek pushed, leaning forward impatiently. "Stop shaking. Just write your name." I brought the pen down toward the paper, shaking even harder. And then, with perfect surgical precision, I jerked my elbow sideways. My forearm slammed directly into the plastic bowl of cheap soup. The bowl flipped over instantly. A massive wave of hot, greasy yellow broth and limp noodles washed entirely over the legal document. The liquid soaked right through the crisp white paper, completely blurring the text, destroying the signature line, and ruining the legal barcode printed at the bottom. "Oh my God!" Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs. She jumped back, knocking her chair over as the hot soup dripped off the table and splashed onto her expensive designer shoes. "I am so sorry," I stammered, keeping my hands trembling in the air. "I am just so tired. My hands will not stop shaking." "I am so sorry, Chloe. Are you blind?" she screamed, completely dropping her fake sweet daughter-in-law act. "You ruined the only copy the lawyer gave us. Do you know how much that cost to draft?" She slammed her smartphone down onto the dry side of the kitchen table and frantically ran over to the kitchen sink, grabbing for a roll of paper towels to wipe the grease off her expensive clothes. Derek stood up furious, throwing his hands in the air and cursing under his breath, while Derek was distracted looking at his ruined shoes, and Chloe was scrubbing her dress at the sink. My eyes darted to the smartphone Chloe had slammed down on the table. The screen suddenly lit up brightly in the dim kitchen. A text message notification popped up on her lock screen. It was not a message from a friend or a business partner. The sender was simply saved under the name Brad. I stared at the glowing screen and read the message quickly before the light faded. The text read, "When does the old man's cash clear? Your casino debt is due Friday. I am not asking you again." The screen went dark, but the words were permanently burned into my mind. I sat back in my wooden chair and looked at my son and his wife. They were busy complaining about the mess, completely unaware that I had just uncovered their darkest secret. This was never about Derek's failing tech startup company. This was never about paying my wife's medical bills. Chloe was a gambling addict. She owed massive amounts of money to a casino boss named Brad, and the deadline was Friday. They were not just greedy. They were in extreme danger. They were trying to steal my house and my pension to save Chloe from the ruthless people she owed money to. They thought they were playing chess against a senile old bricklayer. But they had no idea that I had just seen all their cards. The trap they tried to set for me had just become the exact weapon I would use to destroy them. I hid a cold, calculated smile behind my hand as Chloe stormed back to the table with a wet rag. The war had officially begun. The morning sun crawled through the kitchen blinds but brought no warmth. I was already awake. I had not slept a single minute since I watched my son and his wife leave my house after their pathetic soup incident. I sat at the wooden table staring at the stain where the greasy broth had ruined their fake legal document. The house was too quiet without Ruby. It felt like a tomb. Then the phone on the kitchen counter began to ring. It was the head administrator from the hospital. Her voice was hesitant and professional, but I could hear the confusion hiding underneath. She told me she was calling to confirm a medication change request submitted earlier that morning by my son Derek. She explained that Derek had called the pharmacy department demanding they downgrade Ruby to generic and highly inferior pain medications and blood thinners. He told the hospital staff that the premium post-operative care was too expensive and that he needed to save the estate money. My own son. The boy I had protected with my own body on tough job sites. He was actively trying to cut corners on the medication keeping his mother alive just to preserve the inheritance he thought he was getting. The experimental surgery had saved her brain, but these cheap generic drugs could cause blood clots. Derek was willing to risk his own mother's life to save a few $1,000s that he desperately needed to steal. I did not yell at the administrator. I kept my voice perfectly level. I told her to ignore any and all requests from Derek. I told her that I was the sole provider for my wife and that the black card on file was to be used for the absolute best medication available. I hung up the phone and felt a cold and absolute clarity wash over me. The time for playing defense was over. It was time to call the shark. I picked up the phone again and dialed a private number I had memorized a decade ago. It belonged to Vance. Vance was my corporate attorney. He was not a family lawyer who held hands and mediated feelings. Vance was a predator in a tailored suit. He handled the aggressive acquisitions and legal battles for my secret real estate empire. He was the kind of man who could legally destroy a business before the owner even finished their morning coffee. Vance answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him exactly what Derek had just tried to do at the hospital. I told Vance I needed an ironclad legal barricade around my wife immediately. Vance did not ask questions. He only asked for 10 minutes. Within 2 hours, a team of legal couriers arrived at the hospital. Vance had drafted and filed an absolute medical proxy lockdown. The document stripped Derek of any and all rights to access his mother's medical records. He was officially barred from making any medical or financial decisions regarding Ruby. If Derek even tried to call the nurse's station again, the hospital administration was instructed to forward the call directly to Vance's legal firm. The door was slammed shut in his face and double-bolted, but Vance did not stop there. When you unleash a corporate shark, they do not just bite, they tear the whole boat apart. Later that afternoon, Vance drove to my house. He did not park in the driveway. He parked his sleek black sedan down the street to remain unseen. He walked up to my porch carrying a thick leather briefcase. I let him in and we sat at the kitchen table. Vance opened the briefcase and slid a stack of printed files toward me. He looked at me with eyes that lacked any sympathy. "Leon," he said, his voice completely flat, "I ran a quiet background check on your son and your daughter-in-law. I looked into their businesses and their personal accounts. You need to see this." I looked down at the papers. The truth was far worse than a simple casino debt. Vance pointed to the first document. It was a summary of Derek's tech startup company, the company Derek always bragged about at family dinners, the company that supposedly made him a wealthy genius. Vance explained that the startup was a complete sham. Derek had not created any new software. Instead, he was currently under active federal investigation for defrauding his investors. The authorities were preparing to indict him. He was burning through cash to pay off legal fees and trying to keep the federal agents off his back. If he did not find a massive influx of cash very soon, he was going to federal prison. Then Vance pointed to the second file. It was the financial record for Chloe's luxury spa. The spa, she claimed, was the hottest wellness center in the city. The numbers printed on the page were completely stained in red ink. Chloe was $400,000 in debt. She had taken out reckless business loans and failed to pay her suppliers. Her business was weeks away from being seized by the banks. Combine that with the casino debt I had discovered on her phone, and her situation was completely apocalyptic. Vance leaned back in his chair and looked me dead in the eyes. "They are not just greedy, Leon," he said quietly. "They are desperate. Desperation makes people unpredictable and highly dangerous. They are cornered animals, and they see you and your wife as their only way out. They will not stop until they have drained every single penny you own, or until they are stopped by force." I stared at the financial records. The betrayal was so deep it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. My son was not just a greedy child waiting for an inheritance. He was a criminal facing prison time trying to use his mother's deathbed to fund his escape, and Chloe was right there with him, ready to throw me into an asylum to cover her own reckless failures. I closed the folders and pushed them back toward Vance. I looked at the lawyer and told him to prepare for total war. I told him we were going to let them keep digging their own graves. We were going to let them think they were winning, and when the time was perfectly right, we were going to bury them so deep they would never see the sun again. Vance simply nodded, closed his briefcase, and walked out the back door. The pieces were moving into place. My son thought he was the smartest man in the room, but he forgot who built the room in the first place. I was sitting in my living room holding a cold cup of coffee. The heavy oak clock on the wall ticked loudly in the empty house. Ruby was still recovering in the private hospital wing. 2 days had passed since my corporate lawyer Vance locked down the medical proxy. My son Derek and his wife Chloe were completely blocked from making any decisions regarding my wife. I knew they were running out of time and running out of money. Desperate people take dangerous shortcuts. When the front doorbell rang, I checked the hidden monitor under my kitchen counter. It was Chloe. My daughter-in-law was standing on my front porch. She was not alone. Standing next to her was a tall white man in a sharp gray tailored suit. He had a leather clipboard tucked under his arm. He looked entirely too polished. He looked like a man who sold expensive lies for a living. I knew exactly what this was. They realized they could not force me to sign away my rights with a bowl of soup. They needed to prove I was losing my mind. If they could get a medical professional to declare me legally senile, they could petition the court to seize my entire estate. I did not panic. I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out my reading glasses. They looked like ordinary, thick, black-framed glasses. You can buy them at any pharmacy. But these were not ordinary glasses. I bought them 3 years ago when I suspected one of my commercial building managers was taking bribes. There was a micro camera built directly into the bridge of the frame. It recorded high-definition video and audio straight to a secure cloud server. I slipped the glasses onto my face and pressed the tiny hidden button behind the right hinge. The trap was officially set. I walked to the front door and opened it slowly. I kept my shoulders slumped. I made my hands tremble just a little bit. Chloe gave me a fake, sympathetic smile. She spoke to me in that high-pitched baby voice people use when they think you are stupid. She said, "Dad, we are so worried about you being all alone in this big house. The stress of Mom being in the hospital is just too much. I brought someone to help. This is Dr. Aris. He is a professional grief counselor. I hired him to make sure you are processing your emotions safely." I looked at the man. Dr. Aris extended a soft, manicured hand. He offered his condolences. His voice was smooth like snake oil. He said it was completely normal for a man my age to feel overwhelmed and confused during a medical crisis. He said he just wanted to sit down and ask me a few simple questions to evaluate my well-being. I nodded slowly and invited them inside. I shuffled my feet across the hardwood floor, playing the part of a broken old man. We sat down in the living room. Chloe stood in the hallway, leaning against the doorframe. She crossed her arms and smirked. She thought she had me cornered in my own home. Dr. Aris sat across from me. He clicked his expensive pen and opened his leather clipboard. The micro camera in my glasses captured his face perfectly. It also captured the blank medical evaluation form on his clipboard. It was not a grief counseling intake form. It was a standard psychiatric evaluation for cognitive decline and dementia. The performance began. The doctor started with easy questions. He asked me how I was feeling. I stared blankly at the wall for a few seconds before answering. I muttered that I was just tired and that the house was too cold. He nodded sympathetically and wrote that down. Then he moved to the cognitive traps. He asked me if I knew what year it was. I hesitated. I rubbed my forehead and told him it was 1998. I told him I needed to get my boots on because I was going to be late for my shift at the cement plant. The doctor stopped writing for a brief second. He looked up at me with a glint of absolute triumph in his eyes. He scribbled furiously on his paper. He asked me about my family. He asked me how my son Derek was handling the situation. I looked at him with empty eyes. I asked him who Derek was. I told him my son's name was Marcus and that Marcus was still in high school. I rambled about needing to buy Marcus a new bicycle for his birthday. From the corner of my eye, I saw Chloe cover her mouth to hide a massive grin. She was practically vibrating with joy. She actually believed I had lost my mind overnight. She thought the stress of my wife having a stroke had finally broken my brain. Dr. Aris leaned forward. He asked the golden question. He asked how I was managing my finances with my wife in the hospital. He asked if I felt capable of paying the bills and managing the property taxes. I shook my head and made my lower lip tremble. I whispered that Ruby handled all the pennies. I told him I did not know where the checkbook was. I said, strange people kept calling my phone asking for money, and I was so scared because I did not know how to read the bank statements anymore. I begged him to tell Marcus to come home and help me sort out the mail. That was all he needed to hear. Dr. Aris closed his clipboard with a loud snap. He gave me a patronizing smile and told me to just rest. He said everything was going to be taken care of very soon. He promised that my family would step in and manage the heavy burdens for me. I thanked him profusely. I stood up on shaky legs and walked them to the front door. Chloe did not even say goodbye to me. She just turned around and walked out to the driveway. Dr. Aris followed right behind her. I closed the front door until it was just cracked open. The second the door clicked shut, my trembling stopped. My posture straightened. The confused old bricklayer vanished into thin air. I was Leon again, cold, calculated, and completely in control. I reached up and pressed the hidden button on my glasses to stop the recording. The video file was already safely uploaded to my private server. I had crystal clear audio and video of a licensed medical professional conducting a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation under false pretenses. That alone was enough to destroy his medical license forever. But I needed the final nail in the coffin. I walked swiftly into my home office and sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop and logged into my hidden security system. When I renovated this house 10 years ago, I installed high-definition security cameras hidden inside the porch light fixtures and the driveway motion sensors. They recorded everything in perfect detail. I pulled up the live feed of the driveway. Chloe and Dr. Eris were standing next to her luxury SUV. They were completely unaware that they were starring in the most expensive movie of their lives. I watched the screen closely. Dr. Eris pulled the evaluation form from his clipboard and handed it to Chloe. She read it quickly and smiled. It was exactly what she wanted. A signed medical document stating I was severely incapacitated and unfit to manage my own estate. Then she opened her designer handbag. She reached inside and pulled out a thick white envelope. It was bulging with cash. She handed it directly to the doctor. He took it without hesitation, slipped it inside his tailored suit jacket, and shook her hand. They both laughed about something, probably laughing at how easy it was to fool a grieving old black man. I pressed the record button on my laptop screen and saved the footage directly to my hard drive. I sat back in my leather office chair and watched the doctor get into his car and drive away. Chloe got into her SUV and drove off a minute later. They thought they had just secured their future. They thought that piece of paper was their golden ticket to seizing my house, my bank accounts, and my life. They did not know I now possessed irrefutable video evidence of felony medical fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. They handed me the exact weapons I needed to send them both to federal prison. I picked up my phone and called Vance. I told him we had the bait, the hook, and the fish. It was time to start reeling them in. I sat in my kitchen watching the early morning sun crawl across the hardwood floor. The house was completely silent. Ruby was still resting safely in the VIP hospital wing under heavy security. I was alone, but my mind was working with absolute precision. I knew exactly what my son and his wife were doing. Desperation makes greedy people incredibly reckless. Derek and Chloe had their fake psychiatric report. They had the bribed doctor's signature. They thought they had the ultimate weapon to declare me legally incompetent and seize my entire life. But the legal process for conservatorship takes weeks. It requires court dates and judge approvals. Derek did not have weeks. His tech startup was bleeding cash, and federal agents were circling his office. Chloe was drowning in a massive casino debt owed to very dangerous people. They needed cash immediately. They needed a shortcut to steal my money today. And they took the exact fatal shortcut I was praying they would take. At 9 in the morning, my secure phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was Vance. My corporate attorney did not waste time saying hello. His voice was cold and sharp. He told me the trap had just snapped shut. Derek had just walked into a high-risk predatory lending office downtown. He was trying to take out a $200,000 title loan against my suburban house. He brought the fraudulent medical documents to prove I was unfit to manage my own assets. But he went one step further into pure criminality. He brought a stack of loan applications with forged signatures. My signatures. My own son had sat at his expensive glass desk and practiced forging the name of the man who bought him his first baseball glove. He thought he was a genius. He planned to leverage the equity of the home I built, take the $200,000 in cash, pay off the casino bosses, and let the bank foreclose on my house while I was locked away in a state-run asylum. But Derek failed to do his homework. He assumed this house was just a simple piece of residential real estate owned by a retired bricklayer. He thought it was an easy target for a quick cash grab. What he did not know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I had transferred the deed of this very house into a blind corporate trust more than a decade ago. This house did not belong to Leon and Ruby. It legally belonged to a commercial real estate empire called L&R Holdings. It was legally untouchable by any individual person. It was a financial fortress designed by Vance to be completely bulletproof against lawsuits, creditors, and greedy family members. The moment the loan officer typed my home address into the National Property Registry, a massive fraud alert triggered across their entire banking system. The computer network immediately flagged the transaction as highly suspicious. A residential title loan cannot be issued on a commercial corporate asset without the explicit authorization of the board of directors, and I was the sole board member of that holding company. The lender looked at his computer screen. He looked at the forged signatures on the paperwork. He looked back at Derek. He realized instantly that the man sitting across his desk was actively committing felony identity theft and federal mortgage fraud right there in his lobby. The loan officer quietly locked his office door from the inside and calmly told Derek he was calling the police. Panic is a powerful thing. Derek completely lost his mind. He shoved the loan officer out of the way, kicked open the side exit door, and ran to his luxury sports car like a terrified coward. He drove straight to my house, breaking every speed limit in the city of Atlanta. I knew he was coming. I had a fresh pot of dark roast coffee brewing on the counter. I poured myself a cup and sat down at the kitchen table. I waited. 10 minutes later, the tires of his car screeched violently into my driveway. I heard his heavy footsteps pounding frantically up the wooden stairs of my front porch. He did not knock. He did not ring the bell. He raised his heavy leather shoe and kicked the front door wide open. The wood splintered loudly, and the door slammed hard against the hallway wall. Derek stood in the doorway, panting heavily. He looked nothing like the arrogant tech chief executive he pretended to be. His expensive designer suit was wrinkled. His silk tie was pulled loose. He was sweating profusely, and his eyes were completely wild with raw terror. He looked like a hunted animal, realizing the walls of the cage were closing in on him. He stormed into the kitchen and slammed both of his hands down hard on my wooden table. The coffee in my mug barely rippled. I did not flinch. I just looked at him. "What the hell is L&R Holdings, Dad?" he screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice cracked with sheer panic. "Why is your house in a corporate trust? The bank just threatened to call the police on me. They said the deed does not belong to you. They said I committed federal wire fraud. What did you do to the house?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. I tasted the bitterness, but the moment itself was entirely sweet. I looked up at the boy I had raised. I saw the absolute fear burning in his eyes. I set the coffee mug down gently on the table. I leaned forward and looked right through him. "Because 40 years of laying bricks taught me how to build a foundation nobody can crack," I told him. My voice was dangerously calm. "You thought I was just a tired old man you could push into a cheap mental asylum. You thought you could steal the roof over your dying mother's head to pay for your wife's dirty gambling debts. You forged my name, Derek. You committed a massive federal felony, and you did it on a piece of property that I locked inside a $40 million corporate vault 10 years ago." Derek stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him in the chest. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin pale and sickly. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The realization crashed down on him like a collapsing building. He was not looking at a helpless victim anymore. He was looking at the architect of his absolute destruction. "Get out of my house, Derek," I told him. My tone was absolute ice, "and you better start running right now, because the bank is not the only one calling the police today." He turned and ran. He stumbled blindly down the hallway, ran out the broken front door, and tripped down the porch steps. I sat in my kitchen, finishing my coffee in perfect silence. The trap had snapped shut permanently, and my son was bleeding out. Derek did not just run away. A cornered animal never just runs away. It turns around and bares its teeth. He had made it halfway down the driveway to his shiny sports car before he stopped. He stood there in the morning sun, his chest heaving, his expensive suit ruined by his own sweat and panic. He turned back to look at me standing on the porch of the house he had just tried to steal. The mask was completely gone now. The loving son who brought me cheap soup was dead. The concerned child who wanted to manage his grieving father's finances was gone. In his place stood a desperate, ruthless stranger who was about to lose everything. Derek marched back up the driveway. He did not come inside the house. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at me with eyes full of pure venom. He pointed a shaking finger at my face. He dropped the act completely. "You think you are so smart, old man," Derek shouted, his voice echoing down the quiet suburban street. "You think putting this house in a corporate trust is going to save you. You think you can just cut me off and leave me to drown. You have no idea what I am capable of." I stood perfectly still. I looked down at him from the top of the steps. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I asked him exactly what he thought he was going to do. Derek laughed. It was a cold, hysterical sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of a man who had completely lost his moral compass. "I have a medical report," Derek spat out, his face twisting into a cruel sneer. "I have a legally binding psychiatric evaluation signed by a licensed doctor. It says you are suffering from severe dementia. It says you are completely incapacitated and a danger to yourself. It says you do not even know what year it is." He took a step closer, his eyes wide with a sick, desperate triumph. "I am going to drag you to family court," he threatened, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper. "I am going to stand in front of a judge and hand them that report. I am going to get a full legal conservatorship over you. I will have the court strip you of your right to manage your own life, your own money, and your own properties. And once the judge hands me the keys to your life, I am going to lock you in a state-run psychiatric ward and throw away the key." He was threatening to erase me from society. He was telling his own father, the man who had broken his back pouring concrete so he could go to college, that he was going to bury me alive in a mental asylum just to liquidate my assets. He wanted to strip away my dignity, my freedom, and my humanity. He waited for me to react. He waited for me to cry. He waited for me to fall to my knees and beg him to spare me. He wanted me to negotiate. He wanted me to offer him the money he needed to pay off his fraudulent tech startup debts and his wife's dirty casino loans. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I did not show him a fraction of an inch of fear. 40 years of working on the high steel beams of Atlanta had taught me how to look straight down into the abyss without letting my knees buckle. I looked at the boy I had raised. I looked at the tailored suit I had indirectly paid for by giving him a life of privilege I never had. I felt a deep, hollow sadness in my chest, but it was quickly replaced by a cold and absolute resolve. I stared directly into his panicked, greedy eyes. "You can try," I said. 3 words: quiet, calm, absolute. Derek flinched as if I had slapped him across the face. He expected anger. He expected terror. He did not expect total, chilling indifference. He opened his mouth to scream another threat, but the words died in his throat. He realized in that split second that he was looking at a man who was completely unafraid of him. He turned around, got into his luxury car, and slammed the door. The engine roared as he reversed out of my driveway, nearly hitting the mailbox, and sped off down the street. I watched his car disappear around the corner. Then I went back inside the house. I did not sit down to process my feelings. Feelings do not win court battles. Evidence wins court battles. Derek had laid his final card on the table. He was going to use the fraudulent medical report Chloe had bought from that fake grief counselor. He was going to try to convince a judge that my mind was broken. I knew that in the legal system, whoever has the better paperwork wins. I needed paperwork that would absolutely annihilate his fake doctor. I grabbed my keys and got into my old battered Ford pickup truck. I did not drive to the hospital where Ruby was recovering. I drove straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. I pulled into the parking garage of the most prestigious neurological institute in the entire state of Georgia. I had made a few phone calls from the truck on the way over. When you have the kind of money I have, doors open immediately. I did not have to wait in a lobby for weeks to get an appointment. A team of the top cognitive specialists and neurologists in the city was waiting for me when I walked through the sliding glass doors. I sat in a bright, sterile examination room. For the next 5 hours, I underwent the most rigorous and exhausting cognitive testing available in modern medicine. They did not just ask me what year it was or who the president was. They hooked me up to machines to monitor my brain activity. They made me solve complex spatial reasoning puzzles. They gave me lists of random words and asked me to recall them hours later, mixed in with complicated mathematical equations. They tested my reflexes, my memory retention, my logic processing, and my executive functioning. It was grueling. It was designed to find even the smallest crack in a person's mental foundation. But my mind was a fortress. I treated every test like a blueprint, analyzing it, breaking it down, and solving it with absolute precision. I remembered every name, every number, and every sequence. I did not stumble once. When the testing was finally over, I sat in the chief neurologist's office. He was a highly respected doctor whose testimony was considered absolute gold in any courtroom in the country. He sat behind his desk reviewing the thick stack of my test results. He looked up at me, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "Leon," the doctor said, his voice filled with genuine professional awe, "your results are not just normal for a man of 75, they are extraordinary. You scored in the 99th percentile across the board. Your cognitive function, your memory recall, and your logical processing speed are sharper than men half your age. You have the mental acuity of a 30-year-old executive. There is absolutely zero evidence of dementia, cognitive decline, or any mental incapacity whatsoever." I nodded calmly. I asked him to put it in writing. I told him I needed it certified, notarized, and sealed with the official stamp of his medical institute. He handed me a thick, legally binding medical dossier. It was the ultimate shield. It was undeniable, irrefutable scientific proof that I was in total and complete control of my faculties. No judge in the country would ever question it. I left the clinic and drove straight to the sleek glass building where my corporate attorney Vance had his office. I did not bother checking in with the receptionist. I walked straight past the front desk and pushed open the heavy oak doors to his private suite. Vance was sitting at his massive desk reviewing a stack of corporate acquisitions. He looked up, his predatory eyes scanning my face. He knew I had been busy. I walked over to his desk and dropped the sealed medical dossier right on top of his paperwork. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. Vance picked it up and broke the seal. He read the chief neurologist's summary. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. "This is bulletproof," Vance said quietly. "If your son tries to bring that bribed doctor to court, I will use this to utterly destroy them both. The judge will not just throw out their conservatorship petition. He will recommend the district attorney press charges for perjury and attempted fraud." I stood by the window of his office looking out over the skyline of the city I had spent my life helping to build. Down below, millions of people were going about their lives oblivious to the wars being fought behind closed doors. Derek thought he had me backed into a corner. He thought his empty threats would make me surrender my wealth. He thought he was preparing to lock me in a ward and throw away the key. He had no idea that I had just spent 5 hours building a legal wall that was going to crush him the second he tried to push it. The legal trap was completely set. The bait was in the water. All I had to do now was wait for him to try and bite. I sat in the quiet hospital room next to Ruby. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. I held her warm hand in mine. The experimental surgery had saved her life. She was resting comfortably in the private recovery wing. I knew she was completely safe. That meant I could finally turn my full attention back to the people who tried to put her in the ground. My secure phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an audio file sent by Vance. My lawyer had pulled the security footage from the hidden camera mounted on my front porch. The footage was from 3 days ago when Derek and my daughter-in-law Chloe were standing in my driveway arguing. I put the phone to my ear. I listened to the clear audio of my daughter-in-law speaking. Derek asked Chloe if they should invite me to the big 10th anniversary gala for her luxury spa. Chloe let out a sharp and cruel laugh. She told my son that it was a terrible idea. She said an old black man in dirty work boots would completely ruin the aesthetic of her high-end luxury brand. She said I was a depressing reminder of where Derek came from. She told him I would embarrass her in front of her wealthy investors and ruin her chances of securing more funding. Derek did not defend me. He did not defend his own father. He just nodded and agreed with her. I did not feel angry. Anger is a useless emotion. Anger makes you sloppy and predictable. I felt a cold and absolute focus. Chloe wanted an aesthetic. She wanted to impress her high society financial backers. I decided I was going to give her exactly what she wanted. I was going to give her a night she would never forget for the rest of her miserable life. I left the hospital and drove straight to the financial district of downtown Atlanta. I did not go to a regular department store. I walked into a private tailoring shop reserved strictly for chief executive officers and elite politicians. The master tailor knew me very well. I had bought suits from him for years under my hidden corporate account. I told him I needed something powerful tonight. I needed a suit that commanded the entire room the absolute second I walked through the door. He brought out a custom-fitted suit made from midnight blue Italian wool. It cost exactly $5,000. I put it on in the dressing room. I paired it with a crisp white silk shirt and a solid platinum watch I had kept locked in a heavy safe for the last decade. I looked at myself in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. The tired old bricklayer was completely gone. The man staring back at me was the ruthless founder of a $40 million commercial real estate empire. I pulled out my phone and called a premium luxury concierge service. I did not drive my old battered pickup truck tonight. I ordered a jet black Maybach with a personal chauffeur. I told the driver to take me to the exact address of Chloe's flagship luxury spa. The gala was in full swing when my car pulled up to the curb. The building was a massive commercial space with towering glass windows and polished marble pillars. A bright red carpet was rolled out across the clean sidewalk. Valets were sprinting around parking expensive European sports cars. Loud music was bumping from inside the building. Flashing lights illuminated the night sky. My chauffeur smoothly stopped the Maybach right at the edge of the red carpet. He quickly got out and opened my heavy door. I stepped out into the warm evening air. I adjusted my silk cuffs. I completely ignored the valets. I walked right past the velvet ropes and stepped directly into my daughter-in-law's pretentious anniversary party. The main lobby of the spa was filled with people holding crystal champagne flutes. They were wearing fake smiles and highly expensive designer clothes. They reeked of desperate wealth and sheer arrogance. I blended into the crowd seamlessly. I grabbed a glass of sparkling mineral water from a passing waiter on a silver tray. I took a slow sip and scanned the massive room. It did not take me long to find her. Chloe was standing near the center stage. She was wearing a tight and sparkling silver dress that caught the light. She was holding a microphone and laughing loudly with a group of older white men in expensive suits. These were her primary investors. These were the men she was desperately trying to impress to save her failing business from total bankruptcy. I walked slowly through the crowd. I let the people part out of my way. When you wear a $5,000 suit and walk with absolute undeniable authority, people naturally step aside without even realizing they are doing it. Chloe turned her head to look at the main entrance. Her eyes locked directly onto me across the room. The transformation in her face was instantaneous and absolutely beautiful to witness. The fake smile vanished from her lips. All the color drained entirely from her face, leaving her looking like a pale ghost. Her mouth opened slightly. She blinked rapidly, trying to process what she was seeing. She expected a broken old man in cement-stained work boots. She expected a senile victim she could easily push around and throw into a nursing home. Instead, she saw a commanding corporate executive walking through her luxury spa like he owned the entire city of Atlanta. Panic set in immediately. Chloe dropped her champagne glass on a tall cocktail table. The glass shattered, but she did not care. She rushed over to a large security guard standing near the main bar. She whispered frantically into his ear. She pointed a shaking manicured finger right at my chest. She was ordering him to throw me out into the street. The heavy security guard nodded and started walking aggressively toward me, but I was already making my move. I did not run. I did not panic. I turned smoothly to the man standing directly to my right. It was Richard Sterling. Richard was a billionaire venture capitalist. He was also Chloe's absolute biggest financial backer. Without Richard's money, her pretentious spa would have closed its doors 3 years ago. I knew Richard very well. We had negotiated a massive commercial warehouse zoning deal 5 years ago behind closed doors. I smiled and extended my hand. "Good evening, Richard," I said calmly. Richard turned around. His eyes widened in genuine surprise and deep respect. "Leon," he shouted loudly enough for half the room to hear. "My God, it has been years. What on earth brings a legend of the Atlanta property market to a small wellness gala like this?" Richard grabbed my hand and shook it vigorously. He clapped me on the shoulder like an old friend. The security guard who was coming to throw me out completely froze in his tracks. He stopped dead just 2 feet away from us. He looked at Richard. He looked at me. You do not grab a man who is being openly praised and embraced by the primary investor of the company. The guard slowly backed away and disappeared into the crowded room. Chloe watched the entire interaction from across the room. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. Richard and I started talking business right there in the middle of the gala. We discussed commercial equity rates. We talked about zoning laws and municipal tax codes. I spoke his language flawlessly. I threw out financial projections and market analytics that made the other wealthy investors naturally gather around us. They hung on my every single word. I was commanding the attention of the most powerful men in the room, and I did it without even raising my voice. Chloe could not take it anymore. She pushed her way aggressively through the crowd of investors. She was sweating heavily. Her expensive makeup was starting to run down her cheeks. She was deeply humiliated and profoundly confused by the sheer display of power I was radiating. She stepped into our circle. She tried to force a polite smile, but her lips were trembling violently. Richard looked at her with a big smile. "Chloe, my dear," he said warmly, "you never once mentioned that you had such a powerful man in your family. Leon here is an absolute titan in the commercial real estate sector. Why did you keep him a secret from us?" Chloe stared at me. Her chest was heaving up and down. She could barely form a coherent sentence. She stammered and stuttered. She tried to say something about keeping family and business separate. Her voice was weak and completely devoid of confidence. I looked at her terrified face. I let the silence stretch out, making her sweat even more. I slowly looked up at the high ceiling. I looked at the expensive crystal chandeliers hanging above us. I looked at the polished marble columns. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water. I turned my attention back to Richard. "It is a very beautiful building, Richard," I said. My voice carried clearly over the quiet background music. "The architecture is incredibly solid. The location is prime real estate. I wonder who the landlord is." I shifted my gaze directly back to Chloe. I locked eyes with her. I did not blink. Chloe stopped breathing entirely. She stared at my custom suit. She stared at my calm and ruthless expression. I could literally see the gears grinding inside her panicked brain. She was trying desperately to connect the dots. The old man she despised. The sudden 300% rent hike notice she received yesterday. The threat of a 30-day eviction. The billionaire investors treating me like royalty. The terrifying realization hit her like a speeding truck. I was not just her father-in-law. I was the anonymous chief executive officer of the holding company. I was the man who owned the very ground she was standing on. She began to sweat bullets. She took a shaky step backward. She was drowning in the middle of her own luxury anniversary party. She finally understood that I was not an old fool trapped in a corner. She was trapped in my building, and I was about to tear the roof down right on top of her head. I woke up the next morning feeling more rested than I had in years. The sun was shining brightly through the kitchen window of my suburban home. I poured myself a hot cup of black coffee. I did not need to wear a $5,000 suit today. I was back in my comfortable denim jeans and a faded flannel shirt. My secure phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. It was my corporate lawyer, Vance. He told me the legal courier was exactly 5 minutes away from my daughter-in-law's luxury spa. I took a slow sip of my dark coffee and imagined the exact look of horror that was about to spread across her face. Chloe was probably nursing a massive headache from her pretentious anniversary gala the night before. She was probably snapping at her underpaid employees and trying to figure out how a retired bricklayer knew her billionaire investors. She was sitting in her glass-walled office surrounded by expensive imported orchids and soothing scented candles. She thought her biggest problem was social embarrassment. She had absolutely no idea her entire fake empire was about to collapse before lunch. A man in a sharp gray uniform walked through the front doors of her spa. He completely ignored the soft relaxation music playing through the hidden speakers. He ignored the receptionist who asked him if he wanted to book a deep tissue massage. He walked straight to the front desk and dropped a thick, heavy, certified legal envelope onto the polished marble counter. He demanded a direct physical signature from the business owner immediately. Chloe marched out of her office looking furious that her peaceful aesthetic was being interrupted. She snatched the clipboard and signed the digital pad with a vicious, aggressive swipe of her finger. She ripped the heavy paper envelope open right there in the middle of her elegant lobby. I knew exactly what those legal documents said because I helped Vance draft every single word of them late last night. The letterhead was bold and unforgiving. It carried the official crest of the property management firm that handled all commercial leases for my holding company. The legal notice outlined her exact financial failures in brutal black and white text. It stated that her business was in direct violation of Section 4 of her commercial lease agreement. She had been delinquent on her rent payments for 3 consecutive months. In the commercial real estate world, there is no mercy and there is no grace period for missed payments. The document officially activated a specific penalty clause hidden deep in the fine print. Because she had failed to pay the massive arrears, her lease was immediately restructured. Her monthly rent was increased by 300% effective as of that exact moment. If she failed to pay the new premium balance within 48 hours, she would face a mandatory 30-day eviction. When Chloe signed that lease 5 years ago, she thought she was an untouchable genius. She set up a limited liability company to protect her personal assets. But my property managers do not rent prime downtown real estate to struggling businesses without a personal guarantee. Chloe had signed a document making her personally liable for every single penny of that rent. If her business went bankrupt, my company could legally go after her personal bank accounts and her expensive cars. She did not read the fine print because she was too arrogant. Arrogance is always the most expensive mistake a person can make. Chloe completely lost her mind. The fake sophisticated persona she spent years building shattered into a million jagged pieces. She started screaming at the top of her lungs right in the middle of her tranquil lobby. Wealthy clients wrapped in plush white towels stopped and stared at her in absolute shock. Her employees backed away from her in fear. She threw the heavy legal documents onto the marble floor and screamed at the courier that this was illegal and impossible. The courier simply smiled a polite professional smile, told her to have a nice day, and walked right out the front door. Chloe ran back into her glass office and slammed the door so hard it nearly shattered. I know this because the property manager called Vance immediately after it happened. Chloe dialed the property management office, screaming hysterically into the receiver. She demanded to speak to the anonymous chief executive officer of the holding company. She demanded to know who was running this supposedly corrupt real estate firm. The property manager calmly told her that the owner was a highly private investor who did not take meetings with delinquent tenants. He told her she could either pay the new rent balance today or pack up her expensive massage tables and get out of his building. Panic is a disease that spreads incredibly fast. Chloe hung up the phone and immediately called my son. Derek was sitting in his own failing tech office, probably sweating profusely over the federal investigation that was slowly tightening around his neck. Chloe was hyperventilating and crying uncontrollably. She told Derek that a ruthless landlord was trying to destroy her business. She demanded that Derek wire her $50,000 right that second to cover the new penalty rent and save her spa from a humiliating public eviction. But Derek had no money to give her. He had spent his entire morning trying to secure a fraudulent title loan on my house and failed miserably. He was completely broke. He had to swallow his massive ego and tell his demanding, expensive wife that his accounts were entirely empty. He had to admit that his tech company was bleeding cash and that he could not save her from drowning. The argument they had over the phone must have been spectacular to witness. Two greedy, desperate people realizing they were both sinking in the ocean and neither of them had a life raft. Chloe screamed that he was a useless failure. She reminded him cruelly that she only married him because she thought his family had hidden wealth she could exploit. Now she knew that wealth was locked away in a corporate trust they could not touch. Derek yelled back, telling her to sell her expensive diamond jewelry or borrow money from her rich white friends. They turned on each other like starving wolves the second the money dried up. I sat at my kitchen table listening to Vance recount the chaos over the phone. I felt a deep and profound sense of justice. For years, they had treated me like I was stupid and disposable. They treated my hard physical work like it was something to be ashamed of. They thought laying bricks and pouring hot concrete was beneath their high society status. Now the very bricks I laid were crushing them financially. They were learning the hardest lesson of all. You cannot build a successful life on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and stolen money. The fragile ground beneath their feet was finally giving way, and gravity was taking over. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling completely at peace, knowing the storm I created was wiping their slate clean. I was sitting in the quiet twilight of the hospital recovery wing. The room smelled of clean linen and expensive antiseptic. My wife Ruby was sleeping peacefully in her bed. The experimental surgery had been a complete success, and the color was finally starting to return to her beautiful face. The rhythmic hum of her heart monitor was the only sound in the room. It was a steady, comforting beat that told me the woman I loved more than life itself was going to survive. I held her warm hand in my rough, calloused fingers, and I simply watched her breathe. For a few hours, I let myself forget about the greed and the betrayal that was waiting for me outside those hospital doors. But peace is a luxury that desperate people will never allow you to keep. When you cut off the money supply to greedy people, they do not just walk away quietly. They panic. They thrash around like starving wolves looking for any piece of meat they can tear off the bone. Derek and Chloe were completely out of money, and they were completely out of time. The federal investigators were breathing down Derek's neck for his fraudulent tech startup. Chloe was facing a massive commercial eviction and a terrifying casino debt. They had no cash left to hide behind. They needed a victim, and they thought they could still force me to be that victim. The heavy wooden door to Ruby's private hospital room suddenly swung open without a single knock. It hit the wall with a loud bang that made my wife stir in her sleep. I let go of her hand and stood up. Derek and Chloe marched into the room. They did not look like the arrogant, polished executives they pretended to be just a few days ago. The facade was completely gone. Derek was sweating profusely. His tie was pulled loose, and there were dark, exhausted circles under his eyes. Chloe looked like she had not slept in a week. Her expensive makeup was smudged, and her hands were trembling. They did not come alone. Walking nervously right behind them was a short, balding white man clutching a cheap leather briefcase. He wore a wrinkled suit and had the shifty eyes of a man who made his living in the shadows. I knew exactly what he was. He was a shady notary public, the kind of man who would stamp his official seal on a forged document for a few $100 in cash. They had brought a corrupt legal official into the hospital room of a woman recovering from major arterial surgery. It was the ultimate disrespect. It was a profound violation of everything sacred. They were trespassing on holy ground just to steal my life savings. Derek did not even look at his mother resting in the bed. He marched straight toward me. He tried to use his physical size to intimidate me. He stood uncomfortably close, trying to tower over me. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to feel like a helpless old man trapped in a corner. But I have spent 40 years working on high-rise construction sites balancing on steel beams hundreds of feet in the air. I do not intimidate easily. I did not step back. I looked him dead in the eyes and I waited for him to speak. Chloe moved to the other side of the hospital bed. She unzipped her designer handbag with violent shaking hands. She pulled out a thick stack of legal papers and slapped them down onto the rolling tray table right next to Ruby's medical chart. The shady notary opened his briefcase and pulled out his heavy metal official stamping tool. He set it on the table with a loud clank. He refused to make eye contact with me. He just stared at the floor, waiting for his cue to authorize their criminal conspiracy. Derek reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the fraudulent psychiatric report. The exact same report Chloe had bought with a thick envelope of cash from that fake grief counselor on my front porch. He slammed the fake medical document onto the table right on top of the other papers. "This ends right now, Dad," Derek whispered aggressively. His voice was shaking with raw, manic desperation. "I am done playing games with you. You have locked us out of the corporate trust, but I know you still have liquid assets. I know you have millions sitting in personal savings accounts. You are going to sign these transfer documents right here and right now." Chloe leaned over the bed. She pointed a sharp manicured finger directly at my face. "You are going to sign over full control of those liquid accounts to us, Leon," she demanded. Her voice was shrill and panicked. "If you do not sign those papers giving us the cash, we will take this psychiatric report straight to the family court judge today. We will have you declared completely legally incompetent before the sun goes down. We will lock you in a state-run mental ward and we will drain your accounts through the court system anyway. Save yourself the humiliation and just sign the damn papers." They thought they had me perfectly trapped. They thought the threat of a mental asylum would make me fall to my knees and surrender my wealth. They thought I would sacrifice the money I bled for just to keep my freedom. I looked at the fraudulent psychiatric report sitting on the tray table. I looked at the shady notary holding his pen. Then I looked back at the boy I had raised. The boy I had bought a bicycle for. The boy I had taught how to throw a baseball in the summer heat. He was dead. The man standing in front of me was nothing but a parasite trying to feed off my corpse. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I let out a slow, deep breath. I reached inside the inner pocket of my worn flannel jacket. I did not pull out a pen. I pulled out a heavy, sealed envelope bearing the official gold crest of the most prestigious neurological institute in the entire state of Georgia. I did not hand it to Derek. I threw it directly at his chest. The heavy envelope hit him hard and fell onto the hospital floor. "Pick it up," I commanded. My voice was absolute thunder in that quiet room. "Pick it up and read it." Derek blinked in confusion. He slowly bent down and picked up the envelope. He broke the gold seal and pulled out the thick stack of certified medical documents. Chloe leaned over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the pages frantically. I watched the last remaining shred of hope completely drain from their miserable faces. "That is a certified, legally binding 5-hour cognitive evaluation conducted by the top neurosurgeons in this city," I told them coldly. "It proves that I scored in the 99th percentile for cognitive function and memory recall. It proves that I am sharper than men half my age. It absolutely annihilates that cheap piece of garbage you bought from a fake doctor in my driveway. I have the video of you handing him the bribe, Chloe. You have absolutely no leverage. You have no case. You have nothing but a massive federal fraud charge waiting for you." Derek started to shake. The papers rattled in his trembling hands. The shady notary realized instantly that he had walked right into a massive criminal trap. The notary scrambled to grab his metal stamp in his briefcase, backing away toward the door like a frightened rat. But nobody was leaving this room on their own terms. I reached over to the hospital bed rail. I pressed the red emergency nurse call button, but it was not connected to the nurse's station. I had coordinated with the hospital administration 2 hours ago. That button was a direct signal to the main security office on the ground floor. Within 10 seconds, the heavy wooden door to the room swung wide open. My corporate attorney Vance walked into the room. He looked like the Grim Reaper in a tailored suit. He was flanked by 4 massive, heavily armed hospital security guards. They stepped into the room and immediately surrounded Derek, Chloe, and the terrified notary. Vance did not smile. He opened his leather briefcase and pulled out 2 thick legal folders. He walked directly up to Derek and shoved the first folder hard against his chest. He turned to Chloe and shoved the second folder into her trembling hands. "You are officially being served," Vance said. His voice was completely devoid of mercy. "These are emergency strict restraining orders granted by a superior court judge just 1 hour ago. You have been legally deemed a direct physical and financial threat to my clients. You are hereby barred from coming within 500 feet of Leon or Ruby. You are barred from entering this hospital. You are barred from stepping foot on any property owned by my clients. If you violate this order by a single inch, you will be arrested and jailed immediately without bail." Derek looked down at the restraining order. He was completely broken. The grand illusion of his superiority was shattered into a million pieces. He realized he was not the predator in this room. He was the prey. "Dad, please," Derek whispered. His voice cracked with pathetic, cowardly tears. "Please do not do this. We have no money. We have nowhere to go. The creditors are going to destroy us. You are my father." I looked at him with zero compassion. I felt absolutely nothing for the man standing in front of me. "When your mother was dying, you priced out cheap state-run facilities," I said quietly. "When I was grieving, you hired a fake doctor to lock me in an asylum. You tried to forge my name to steal the roof over my head. You are not my son. You are just a mistake I am finally correcting. Get out of my wife's room." Vance nodded to the armed security guards. The guards stepped forward and grabbed Derek and Chloe firmly by the arms. They did not give them a chance to argue. They physically dragged my son and my daughter-in-law out of the room. I watched them being escorted down the bright hospital hallway like common criminals. The shady notary ran ahead of them, sprinting toward the exit to save his own skin. The door slowly swung shut, clicking softly into place. The room was quiet again. Vance looked at me and gave a short, respectful nod before stepping out into the hallway to stand guard. I turned back around and sat down in the chair next to the hospital bed. I reached out and gently took Ruby's warm hand back into mine. The steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor continued its comforting song. The poison had been completely extracted from our lives. We were finally safe. The hospital room was peaceful once again, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had won the war. The hospital room was finally quiet, but the war inside my mind was far from over. I sat by the window watching the city lights of Atlanta flicker in the dark. I had successfully banished my son and his greedy wife from the hospital. I had secured my wife Ruby and placed an iron shield around her medical care. My corporate lawyer Vance had served them with strict restraining orders. They were physically locked out of my life. But I knew from 40 years of working in construction that a building does not fall just because you lock the front door. If you want to demolish a corrupt structure, you do not attack the outside. You attack the foundation. You plant the explosives deep inside the basement, and you let the building collapse under its own rotten weight. Greedy people have absolutely no loyalty. They do not know what love is. They only understand leverage and shared interests. Derek and Chloe were bound together by desperation and the illusion of my money. I knew that the absolute second the money dried up, they would turn on each other like starving wolves. I just needed to give them a reason to bite. I decided it was time to destroy their alliance from the inside out. I pulled out my secure phone and called the private investigator that Vance had hired for me. This investigator was a ghost. He was a man who specialized in digging up the dirty secrets that arrogant people thought were buried forever. He had been quietly tracking Chloe for weeks. He followed her digital footprint. He tracked her location data. He knew every single lie she had ever told. I told the investigator that the trap was set. I told him it was time to drop the ultimate bomb on my son. Derek was currently sitting in his downtown tech office. His startup company was a complete failure. The federal agents were breathing down his neck for investor fraud. His employees had already quit because their paychecks bounced. He was sitting alone in a massive glass office surrounded by empty cubicles and the crushing weight of his own massive ego. He was completely isolated. It was the perfect time to strike a fatal blow. The investigator prepared a thick manila envelope. There was no return address. There were no identifying marks. He dressed in a generic courier uniform and walked right through the front doors of Derek's failing tech company. The reception desk was completely empty. The investigator walked straight down the hallway to the glass door of the chief executive office. He pushed the door open and dropped the heavy paper envelope directly onto Derek's expensive modern desk. He turned around and walked out without saying a single word. I know exactly what happened next because I made sure my investigator planted a microscopic audio bug inside the binding of that thick folder. I was sitting in my home office sipping a cup of dark black coffee. I had my headphones on and I was listening to the live audio feed transmitted directly from Derek's desk. I heard the heavy silence of his empty office. Then I heard him sigh heavily. I heard the sound of paper ripping. Derek tore open the manila envelope. He probably thought it was another lawsuit from a furious investor or another eviction notice for his commercial lease. He tipped the envelope upside down. I heard a stack of thick, glossy photographs slide out and hit the glass surface of his desk. These were not regular pictures. They were high-definition photographs taken by a professional with a very long telephoto lens. They were crystal clear and utterly undeniable. The photos showed Chloe on a massive luxury yacht in the bright sunshine of Miami, Florida. She was supposed to be at a wellness conference that weekend, but she was not at a conference. She was wearing designer sunglasses and a tiny bathing suit. She was drinking expensive champagne and laughing under the bright blue sky. But she was not alone. She was wrapped tightly around a tall white man. The man was Brad. Brad was the ruthless casino owner that Chloe owed hundreds of thousands of dollars to. The man she was terrified of. But in these photos, she did not look terrified at all. She looked completely relaxed. She was kissing him passionately on the deck of the yacht. She was smiling at him with a look of pure adoration. She was living a secret billionaire lifestyle while her husband was back in Atlanta facing federal prison and trying to steal his own father's suburban house. I sat in my home office listening to the audio feed. I heard Derek shuffling the glossy photos. I heard his breath catch in his throat. I heard the sharp, painful gasp of a man who was looking at the brutal reality of his pathetic marriage. But the photographs were not the weapon. The photos were just the distraction. The real weapon was the second stack of papers inside the envelope. My private investigator did not just take pictures from a distance. He was a professional. He had cloned Chloe's phone data through an unsecured public wireless network at her spa. He had downloaded her entire text message history. He printed out full-color screenshots of her private conversations with Brad. I heard Derek pick up the printed pages. The text messages were printed in bold black ink. They were dated just 3 days ago, right around the time Chloe brought that fake soup to my house and tried to force me to sign away my legal rights. The words on the page were a direct knife twisting into Derek's heart. I had read them myself before the investigator delivered the package. Chloe wrote to Brad that Derek was a complete and utter loser. She complained that his tech company was a pathetic joke and that he was too stupid to realize the federal agents were going to arrest him soon. She told her casino lover that Derek was a weak man who could not even convince his dying parents to hand over their bank accounts. But the final text message was the absolute death blow. Chloe promised Brad that she had a perfect exit strategy. She wrote that she was only staying in Atlanta long enough to drain the old man's pension and liquidate his real estate. She promised her lover that the absolute second the cash cleared the bank, she was going to file for an immediate divorce. She told Brad she would take half of everything Derek stole from his parents and fly straight to Miami so they could be together forever. She was actively planning to discard my son like a piece of useless garbage. She was using him as a temporary tool to execute the dirtiest crime imaginable. The silence on the audio feed was heavy and thick. It was the sound of a grown man breaking into a million jagged pieces. I heard Derek drop the papers onto his desk. I heard his breathing become erratic and shallow. He was hyperventilating. In that exact moment, Derek realized the horrific magnitude of his own choices. He realized he had thrown his entire life away for absolutely nothing. He had conspired to murder his own parents financially. He had looked the surgeon in the eye and agreed to let his mother die to save a few bucks. He had tried to lock the father who raised him in a state-run mental asylum. He had burned every bridge of unconditional love and loyalty he ever had. And he did it all for a woman who deeply despised him. A woman who called him a loser behind his back. A woman who was sleeping with a casino boss on a luxury yacht while he was busy forging signatures and committing federal crimes to save her failing business. He sold his soul to the devil, and the devil did not even want him. The illusion of his perfect wealthy life was completely shattered. He was not a genius tech executive. He was a foolish, desperate pawn. He was the punchline to a cruel joke played by a woman who manipulated his greed for her own survival. I listened through my headphones as the pain turned into sheer, explosive rage. I heard a loud, deafening crash. Derek swept his arm across his glass desk with violent force. He threw his expensive computer monitor to the hardwood floor. He shattered his keyboard against the wall. He knocked over his coffee mug and sent the glossy photos flying across the room. He screamed at the top of his lungs. It was not a scream of anger. It was a scream of pure, agonizing agony. It was the sound of total and complete betrayal echoing through a hollow, empty office. He screamed and cursed and destroyed everything within his reach. He was tearing down his own office just like he tore down his own family. He wept loudly and pathetically. He realized he was entirely alone in the world. He had no money, he had no company, he had no wife, and he had no father to run to for help. I slowly took my headphones off and placed them on my desk. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at my quiet neighborhood. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him. Pity is reserved for victims. Derek was not a victim. He was a predator who walked blindly into a trap and found a bigger predator waiting in the dark. The alliance between my son and his wife was officially dead. The war they tried to wage against me was over. They were going to turn around and completely destroy each other with all the hatred and venom they had left. I did not have to lift another finger. I just had to sit back and watch the building collapse exactly as I planned. The sky above Atlanta opened up and unleashed a massive thunderstorm. The rain came down in thick, heavy sheets, washing the suburban streets clean. Thunder rattled the windows of my brick house, but I was not afraid of the storm. I was sitting in my dark living room drinking a warm cup of black tea. The house was completely quiet. It was the kind of deep, profound silence that only comes after you have successfully removed a cancer from your life. My wife Ruby was still resting safely in the private recovery wing of the hospital, and the doctor said she would be coming home soon. I had nothing but time to sit and watch the rain fall. I turned my head and looked at the glowing screens of my security monitors. The infrared cameras illuminated the long driveway and the empty street in front of my property. That was when I saw him. A cheap, rusty taxi pulled up to the curb far down the street. It was not the luxury sports car my son used to drive. That car had already been repossessed by the bank. The taxi door opened and a man stepped out into the pouring rain. He did not have an umbrella. He did not have a heavy coat. He was wearing a thin, wrinkled dress shirt that immediately clung to his shivering skin. It was Derek, the boy I had raised. The boy who tried to put me in a mental asylum and pull the plug on his own mother. He walked slowly up the wet sidewalk. His shoulders were completely slumped. His head was hanging low. He looked like a beaten dog that had been kicked out into the street. But he did not walk all the way up to my front porch. He stopped exactly at the edge of my driveway. He stopped right next to the municipal sidewalk. He was terrified of crossing the property line. My corporate lawyer Vance had made the restraining order explicitly clear. If Derek stepped one single foot onto my property, he would be arrested and thrown into a concrete cell without bail. The federal agents were already looking for him, and he knew a local arrest would seal his fate completely. So he stood there in the freezing rain, soaking wet and shivering, respecting the legal boundary out of pure, sheer terror. I set my teacup down on the wooden coffee table. I stood up and walked to the front door. I did not feel a single ounce of compassion. Pity is an emotion reserved for people who make honest mistakes. Derek did not make a mistake. He made a calculated, ruthless choice to destroy his parents for money. I opened the heavy wooden door and stepped out onto the covered porch. I stayed completely dry under the roof while my son stood out in the middle of the violent thunderstorm. "Dad," he shouted. His voice was raw and pathetic, carrying over the sound of the pouring rain. "Dad, please do not go back inside. Please just look at me. Just listen to me for 1 minute." I stood by the wooden railing. I did not say a word. I just looked down at him. I let the cold, hard silence speak for me. Derek fell to his knees on the wet concrete. The muddy water splashed against his ruined dress pants. He wrapped his arms around his own chest, trying to stay warm. He looked up at me and began to weep. It was not a quiet, dignified cry. It was the loud, ugly sobbing of a man who had completely destroyed his own life and had nowhere else to run. "She left me, Dad," he screamed through his tears. Chloe packed her bags and left me. She took everything she could carry. She emptied the joint accounts, and she ran away. I saw the text messages you sent to my office. I saw the pictures of her in Miami with that casino boss. You were right about her. You were right about everything. She never loved me. She just used me to try and steal your money. I was so stupid. I was so blind. I listened to his pathetic confession. He wanted me to feel sorry for him because his greedy wife had betrayed him. He wanted me to see him as a victim of her manipulation. But I knew the truth. Chloe did not force him to forge my signature on those mortgage documents. Chloe did not force him to agree to let his mother die on a hospital bed. He made those choices because he was a coward who valued his fake, wealthy lifestyle more than he valued his own flesh and blood. "Dad, the federal agents are raiding my office right now," Derek cried out. His voice was shaking violently. "The Securities and Exchange Commission found out about the fraudulent investor reports. They know I lied about the software development. They are going to indict me tomorrow morning. The lawyer said I am facing 10 years in a federal penitentiary. 10 years, Dad. I will not survive in there. I will die in there. He crawled forward a few inches but stopped himself before his knees crossed my property line. He clasped his hands together in a desperate begging motion. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. I need $150,000, Dad, he begged. His voice broke into a pathetic wail. The lawyer said if I can pay back the primary investors today, they might drop the federal fraud charges down to a misdemeanor. I just need $150,000 to stay out of federal prison. I know you have it. I know you run that massive real estate company. Please, Dad. I am your son. I am your only child. Please do not let them lock me in a cage. I am so sorry for what I did. I will do anything you want. I will work for you for free. I will clean your floors. Just please save me. I stood on the porch and watched the rain wash over his desperate face. He was begging me for the exact same amount of money that the hospital needed to save his mother's life. $150,000. When the surgeon asked Derek for that exact amount, he did not hesitate to say no. He looked the doctor in the eye and said we were just poor retired construction workers and that they should just let my wife die. Now he was on his knees in the mud begging me for that exact same sum to save his own miserable skin. The irony was not just poetic, it was absolute perfection. I slowly walked down the porch steps. I stopped under the edge of the roof, staying perfectly dry. I looked down at the pathetic, broken man shivering in the storm. I did not feel anger. I did not feel sorrow. I felt an overwhelming sense of closure. I took a deep breath of the cold, wet air. I looked directly into his red, crying eyes. My voice was calm, steady, and colder than the freezing rain falling around him. When your mother was dying in that intensive care unit, you stood in the stairwell and priced out cheap state-run facilities, I told him. My words cut through the sound of the storm like a sharp steel blade. When the doctor told you she needed a surgery to save her brain, you told him to let her pass away because you wanted to save the estate money. When I was sitting in that waiting room mourning the stroke that nearly killed my wife, you brought a fake doctor to my house to declare me legally insane. You tried to lock me in an asylum so you could steal the roof over my head. Derek sobbed louder, holding his hands up toward me as if asking for a hug. Dad, please. I was desperate. I was not thinking straight. I did not let him finish. I did not let him make another miserable excuse. You forged my name, I continued, my voice rising with absolute authority. You tried to rob the man who broke his back pouring concrete so you could wear expensive suits and pretend to be a genius. You betrayed every single value I ever taught you. You sold your soul to a woman who despised you, and you tried to sacrifice your own parents to pay for her gambling debts. Derek lowered his head and wept into his hands. He knew every word I said was the undeniable truth. He had no defense. He had no justification. He was stripped entirely bare. You came here begging me to save you from federal prison, I said, looking down at his shaking shoulders. You came here calling me your father. But a father is someone who raises a man. I did not raise a man. I raised a parasite. I raised a coward who would rather see his mother in a grave than face the consequences of his own financial failures. I took one step back up the porch stairs. I looked at him one last time. I wanted to make sure my final words burned themselves permanently into his memory. I wanted him to hear them echoing in his mind every single night he spent sleeping on a hard concrete cot in a federal penitentiary. I do not have a son anymore, I told him. My voice was completely hollow and final. The boy I raised died the second he agreed to pull the plug on his mother for a real estate payout. Do not ever come back to this house. Do not ever call my phone again. You are nothing to me but a stranger standing in the rain. I turned around and walked back up the wooden steps. I did not look back. I opened the heavy front door and stepped inside the warm, quiet sanctuary of my home. I closed the door firmly behind me and locked the deadbolt. The loud click of this metal lock was the final sound of my victory. I walked back to the living room and picked up my warm cup of tea. I sat down in my favorite chair and looked at the security monitors. Derek was still kneeling in the mud, crying alone in the dark. I watched him for a few seconds before I reached over and turned the monitor off completely. The storm was still raging outside, but inside my house there was nothing but perfect, absolute peace. I stood in the warm, quiet hallway of my house, listening to the thunder rattle the windows. I had told my son to leave. I had told him he was no longer my flesh and blood. But as I watched the security monitor, I saw that Derek had not moved. He was still kneeling in the freezing mud at the edge of my driveway. He was completely broken. The federal agents were coming for him in the morning. He had absolutely nowhere else to go. I knew he was waiting for the police to arrive or for the storm to wash him away into the gutter. I looked at the heavy wooden door. I knew I had one final piece of business to conclude before I could truly close this dark chapter of my life, forever. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy flannel jacket. My fingers brushed against a thick, folded legal document. My corporate attorney Vance had prepared this specific document late last night, anticipating this exact moment of sheer desperation. I unlocked the deadbolt and pushed the front door open one last time. I stepped back out onto the covered porch. The cold wind blew a fine mist of rain across my face. Derek looked up when he heard the heavy door open. His eyes were completely bloodshot and swollen from crying. His expensive dress shirt was plastered to his shivering skin, ruined by the mud and the relentless storm. He tried to stand up, but his legs were too weak. He stayed on his knees, looking up at me like a condemned prisoner waiting for the executioner to speak. I walked slowly down the wooden steps. I stopped at the very edge of the dry concrete, just inches away from the pouring rain. I looked down at the pathetic man shivering in the driveway. I did not feel any warmth or forgiveness in my heart. I only felt the cold, calculated resolve of a man who was about to sever a diseased limb to save the rest of his life. I pulled the thick legal document from my jacket pocket. It was printed on heavy waterproof parchment paper designed to withstand the elements. I held it out in my right hand. Derek stared at the white paper. His entire body was shaking violently from the freezing cold and the overwhelming fear of federal prison. He opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my left hand to silence him. I told him to listen to me very carefully because I was only going to say these words exactly one time. I told him this was the absolute end of the road for him, and that there would be no more negotiations and no more second chances. I told him the piece of paper in my hand was a legally binding renunciation of inheritance drafted by the most ruthless corporate lawyers in the state of Georgia. I explained that it was an irrevocable contract. If he signed his name on the dotted line, he would officially and permanently surrender any and all future rights to my estate. He would be legally disinherited, stripping him of any claim to my properties, my bank accounts, and my legacy. Derek looked at the paper and then looked up at my face. He was shivering so hard his teeth were chattering audibly over the sound of the rain. He whispered that he did not care about the house anymore. He sobbed that he just wanted to stay out of a federal penitentiary. I looked down at him and felt a bitter sense of irony. I told him he had absolutely no idea what he was actually giving up. I decided to pull the final curtain back and let him see the massive empire he had destroyed his own life to steal. I kept my voice perfectly level and cold. I told him that while he was busy playing a fake tech executive and running his company into the ground, I had spent the last decade building a commercial real estate empire. I told him that the holding company he tried to steal this house from was worth over $40 million in liquid assets and prime commercial properties. I told him I was the sole owner and chief executive officer of that entire empire. The revelation hit Derek harder than a physical blow to the head. His crying stopped instantly. The sheer magnitude of the wealth he had just been told about completely paralyzed his brain. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. His jaw dropped open. He realized in that agonizing moment that if he had just been a loyal son, if he had just loved his mother and respected his father, he would have eventually inherited a multi-million-dollar fortune. He would have been set for life. He would have never had to worry about money or federal investigators or greedy, manipulative wives ever again. But instead, he chose to conspire against the people who gave him life. He chose to align himself with a woman who despised him to steal pennies when he was already standing on top of a gold mine. The absolute tragedy of his own stupidity crushed whatever was left of his spirit. He slumped forward, resting his hands in the muddy puddles on the driveway, completely devastated by the reality of his own catastrophic choices. I did not give him time to mourn the fortune he lost. I stepped slightly closer to the edge of the rain. I looked down at his broken form and delivered the final ultimatum. I told him, if you sign this giving up all future rights to my estate, I will pay the $150,000 directly to the federal courts to keep you out of prison. You walk away with your freedom, but not a single penny more. Ever. I made sure he understood the mechanics of the deal perfectly. I told him the money would never touch his personal bank accounts. Vance would wire the funds directly to the federal prosecutor's office to cover the restitution for his defrauded investors. He would not see a single dime of that cash. The only thing he would get from me was the ability to sleep in a cheap apartment instead of a federal prison cell. I told him he would spend the rest of his life working minimum wage jobs to survive, and he would do it completely alone without a family and without a safety net. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out a heavy metal pen. I held it out toward him along with the legal document. Derek stared at the pen. The rain was washing over his face, mixing with his tears. He knew this was the absolute end of his life as he knew it. He knew he was signing away his birthright, his legacy, and his family. But he also knew that if he refused, he would be arrested by federal agents at dawn and thrown into a maximum security penitentiary for the next decade of his life. He slowly reached out his trembling hand. His fingers were completely numb from the freezing rain. He took the heavy metal pen from my grip. He placed the thick waterproof document on the wet concrete of the driveway. He leaned over it, his shoulders shaking violently with every breath he took. He pressed the tip of the metal pen against the signature line. He hesitated for one brief, agonizing second. Then he dragged the pen across the page, writing his name in shaky, uneven letters. He signed away his entire existence in the pouring rain. He dropped the pen onto the wet concrete. He did not look up at me. He could not bring himself to look his father in the eyes ever again. I reached down and picked up the document. I checked the signature to make sure it was legible and legally binding. It was perfect. I folded the heavy parchment paper and placed it safely back into the dry inner pocket of my jacket. I looked down at the stranger kneeling in my driveway. I told him the wire transfer would be completed by Vance first thing in the morning. I told him to get up off my property and never come back. Derek slowly pushed himself up from the mud. His legs were unsteady. He looked completely hollowed out. His eyes were dead and empty. He had no family left. He had no wife. He had no business, and he had no future. He turned around and began to walk away down the dark street. He did not go back to his cheap taxi. He just walked aimlessly into the violent thunderstorm, letting the heavy rain wash over his ruined clothes. I stood on the porch and watched him disappear into the dark shadows of the neighborhood. The storm raged on around us, but the deep, lingering pain in my chest was finally gone. I had protected my wife. I had protected my empire. And I had completely severed the rotting branch that threatened to poison the rest of my tree. I turned around and walked back inside my warm, bright house, locking the heavy wooden door behind me for the absolute last time. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds over the city of Atlanta. The violent thunderstorm from the night before had washed the concrete streets completely clean. The air outside was crisp and cold, but inside the penthouse suite of the tallest commercial skyscraper in the financial district, the atmosphere was perfectly climate-controlled. I was sitting at the very top of the world. This massive glass and steel building was the true beating heart of my secret empire. It was the absolute center of L&R Holdings, the company named after Leon and Ruby, the company I built from the ground up with calloused hands, spilled blood, and decades of relentless physical labor. Today, I was not playing the part of a tired, old, retired bricklayer. Today, I was the chief executive officer waiting patiently for a very specific rat to walk blindly into my trap. Across town, my daughter-in-law Chloe was waking up in her overpriced rented townhouse. She had absolutely no idea that the world as she knew it had already ended. She was completely unaware that her husband Derek was currently sleeping on the floor of a cheap motel. She did not know he had been totally disinherited, stripped of his future, and left to face federal indictments entirely alone. She had blocked his phone number late last night the second she realized his bank accounts were empty. Chloe possessed zero loyalty. She only cared about her own desperate survival. She thought she was the smartest, most cunning person in the entire city. She was busy preparing for the most important performance of her miserable, shallow life. She had somehow managed to beg, scream, and threaten her way into a final desperate meeting with my property management firm that morning. She had demanded an exclusive audience with the anonymous owner of the commercial building where her failing luxury spa was located. She refused to speak to the lower-level managers. She insisted she could only negotiate her massive overdue debts directly with the chief executive officer of L&R Holdings. My corporate attorney Vance had called me and asked if I wanted to cancel her appointment. I told Vance to let her come. I wanted to look her in the eyes when I tore her fake reality to pieces. Chloe dressed herself like a starving predator preparing for a desperate hunt. She bypassed all her professional business suits and reached into the back of her closet. She chose her most provocative designer outfit, She put on a tight crimson-red dress that cost more than what most honest working people make in an entire month. The fabric clung to her body, leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination. She slipped her feet into her tallest black stiletto heels. She spent 2 full hours sitting in front of her vanity mirror applying immaculate expensive makeup. She contoured her face to make herself look perfectly vulnerable but undeniably attractive. She literally practiced her fake tears in the bathroom mirror, watching her own reflection to make sure she looked like a tragic, beautiful victim. She knew her luxury spa was facing a 300% rent increase. She knew she had received a mandatory 30-day eviction notice. She knew she was drowning in $400,000 of commercial debt and that her secret casino lover was demanding his money by Friday. But Chloe truly believed she could charm her way out of any consequence. Her entire life was built on using her looks to manipulate foolish men. She had completely convinced herself that the anonymous chief executive officer of L&R Holdings was just another rich, old, white billionaire. She spent her entire adult life manipulating wealthy older men who thought with their wallets and their egos. She thought she was walking into a boardroom with an arrogant, soft old fool who would take one look at her tight red dress and her fake weeping eyes and immediately forgive her massive financial debts. She planned to cross her legs, lean over his heavy mahogany desk, and offer whatever it took to keep her superficial business open. She was completely intoxicated by her own supreme arrogance and her deeply ingrained racial prejudices. She could never in a million years imagine that a black man from the working class could own the sky over Atlanta. She drove her leased luxury sports car into the busy, bustling financial district of downtown Atlanta. She pulled into the exclusive underground parking garage of my towering glass skyscraper. She tossed her car keys to the valet attendant with a condescending, dismissive smirk. She did not even say thank you. She walked into the massive polished marble lobby of the building completely unaware that every single square inch of the expensive granite beneath her designer shoes belonged entirely to the man she had repeatedly called a useless old hag. Chloe approached the main security desk with an air of absolute entitlement. She demanded immediate access to the executive penthouse suite. The security guards had already been thoroughly briefed by Vance. They treated her with cold, absolute professionalism. They did not smile, and they did not welcome her. They simply checked her name off a digital list and directed her toward the private VIP elevator bank reserved exclusively for top-tier executives and high-net-worth clients. Chloe walked away from the desk with a haughty, exaggerated sway of her hips. She stepped inside the private elevator and the heavy, polished steel doors slid shut seamlessly. The heavy metal box began its rapid, smooth ascent to the top floor of the city. Inside the quiet elevator, Chloe pulled out a small silver hand mirror from her designer handbag. She checked her bright red lipstick one last time to make sure it was absolutely perfect. She forced a single fake tear to well up in the corner of her eye, testing her ability to cry on command. She took a deep, calming breath and pushed her chest out to maximize the provocative effect of her crimson dress. She was absolutely certain she was about to conquer the world and secure her financial salvation. She thought she was riding the elevator to a new beginning. She did not realize she was riding the elevator directly to her own execution. The elevator chimed softly with a pleasant electronic tone. The polished steel doors opened onto the 50th floor. The penthouse suite of L&R Holdings was an intimidating masterpiece of modern architecture and undeniable power. The floors were cut from seamless black marble that reflected the light like a dark mirror. The walls were lined with original contemporary art and thick panels of frosted glass. A sleek, minimalist reception desk sat right in the center of the massive open room. My personal executive assistant stood up to greet her. She was a sharp, brilliant black woman with 2 law degrees who knew exactly what kind of trap had been set today. She asked Chloe to confirm her identity for the visitor log. Chloe stated her name with profound impatience, demanding to see the boss immediately because her time was incredibly valuable. My assistant nodded politely and maintained a perfectly blank expression. She stepped out from behind the desk and led Chloe down a long, quiet hallway. The sound of Chloe's sharp stiletto heels echoed loudly in the silent, intimidating corporate space. Click, clack, click, clack. Every single step she took was a step closer to the absolute destruction of her fake life. The assistant stopped in front of a massive set of double doors made of solid, imported dark mahogany. She opened the heavy doors with a smooth push and gestured for Chloe to step inside the executive boardroom. Chloe walked slowly into the room. It was a sprawling, majestic space specifically designed to make visitors feel incredibly small and insignificant. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. You could see the highways, the skyscrapers, and the distant suburbs stretching out for miles. The morning sunlight poured into the room, illuminating a massive custom-built conference table made of dark, polished walnut. The room smelled of rich leather and expensive wood polish. At the very head of the long walnut table, sitting perfectly centered in front of the massive glass windows, was an enormous, high-backed black leather executive chair. The heavy leather chair was turned completely away from the door. It was facing the expansive view of the bright city skyline. I was sitting quietly in that massive chair. I was not wearing a regular business suit. I was wearing my scuffed, cement-stained brown construction boots paired with a pristine, custom-tailored dark Italian blazer. It was the perfect combination of the mud I came from and the empire I had built. I listened to the sound of her expensive heels clicking nervously against the hardwood floor as she stepped further into the massive boardroom. My assistant stepped backward out of the room. The heavy mahogany doors clicked firmly shut behind Chloe, locking us both inside the quiet space. Chloe cleared her throat softly, trying to project an air of delicate, feminine vulnerability. She stood at the opposite end of the massive walnut table, clutching her designer handbag. She stared at the back of the tall leather chair. She naturally assumed the powerful white billionaire landlord was simply admiring his beautiful city while he waited for her to speak. She put her hands together in a highly rehearsed pose of desperate sorrow. She lowered her head just a fraction to look submissive. She prepared her vocal cords to unleash the dramatic weeping performance of a lifetime. She opened her mouth to begin her fake sobbing apology. She was completely unaware that the man sitting silently in the dark leather chair was about to spin around and tear her entire universe to absolute shreds. I stood at the end of the massive walnut table. I kept my heavy leather chair turned toward the huge glass windows. I looked out over the sprawling city of Atlanta. I watched the tiny cars moving on the highway far below. The boardroom was incredibly quiet. I listened to the sound of her expensive heels clicking nervously against the hardwood floor. She took a deep breath to steady herself. Then she began to speak. Her voice was perfectly calibrated. She sounded soft and fragile. She sounded like a woman who was carrying the weight of the entire world on her delicate shoulders. She addressed the back of my chair. She called me sir. She said she knew she was behind on her commercial rent, and she was deeply embarrassed to be in this position. She told the anonymous billionaire landlord that she was a hardworking small business owner who had poured her entire heart and soul into her luxury spa. She lied so beautifully and effortlessly. She said her wellness business was her absolute passion and she just needed a small extension to get back on her feet. Then she brought up her family. She used her own husband and her in-laws as a pathetic excuse for her massive financial failures. She told the back of my chair that her husband Derek was struggling with his tech company and she was the sole provider for her household. And then she brought me up. She actually used my name. She told the anonymous chief executive officer that her father-in-law, Leon, was a senile, poor old man who was completely losing his mind. She claimed that my medical bills and my constant need for supervision were totally draining her personal finances. She said she was forced to spend all her spa revenue to take care of a broken old bricklayer who did not even know what year it was. She put her hand over her chest and forced a fake tear to roll down her perfectly contoured cheek. She said she just needed a little bit of grace. She begged for a stay of eviction. She said she needed this spa to survive because she was the only one keeping her family from drowning. I sat in my dark leather chair and listened to her vicious lies. She was painting herself as a martyr. She was using the very man she tried to destroy as a human shield to save her pretentious business. I felt a cold and absolute calm wash over my entire body. 40 years of pouring concrete teaches you infinite patience. You wait for the cement to cure before you walk on it. I waited for her to finish her pathetic sob story. I let her empty all her lies into the quiet room. When she finally stopped speaking, the silence in the boardroom was incredibly heavy. She waited for the rich white billionaire to turn around and offer her a tissue and a massive rent reduction. I reached out and grabbed the armrest of my heavy leather chair. I pushed my foot against the floor. I slowly spun the massive chair around to face her. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind me. It illuminated my entire figure. I was not wearing a standard corporate suit. I was wearing my old, heavy brown work boots. The same boots I wore when I hauled steel beams across this very city. They were scuffed and permanently stained with gray cement dust. But above my waist, I was wearing a pristine, custom-tailored Italian blazer. It was the perfect visual representation of the man I truly was. The mud of the working class mixed directly with the absolute power of the corporate elite. Chloe looked at my face. Her brain completely stopped working. Her eyes widened to the size of large coins. All the color instantly drained from her perfectly painted face, leaving her looking like a pale, terrified corpse. Her mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. She literally stumbled backward. Her knees gave out slightly. Her expensive designer purse slipped from her trembling fingers and hit the polished hardwood floor with a loud, heavy thud. Her expensive lipstick and her car keys spilled out onto the ground. She did not even try to bend down and pick them up. She stared at my face, and then she stared at my cement-stained work boots. She tried to speak, but she only managed to push out a few broken, terrified syllables. She stammered and choked on her own breath. She asked if it was really me. She asked if I was really the chief executive officer of L&R Holdings. I did not smile. I did not show her a single ounce of mercy or compassion. I leaned forward and rested my rough, calloused hands on the polished walnut table. I looked directly into her panicked eyes. I told her that my name was Leon. I told her that the R in the company name stood for Ruby, the exact same woman she wanted to let die in a hospital bed to save a few bucks on medical bills. I told her that while she was busy looking down on my dirty work boots, I was busy buying the massive commercial building where she stood. I reached out and tapped the screen of the sleek tablet resting on my desk. The massive flat-screen television mounted on the boardroom wall instantly flickered to life. The high-definition video I captured from my hidden porch camera began to play in crystal-clear resolution. The audio filled the quiet corporate boardroom. Chloe watched herself on the giant screen. She watched herself standing in my suburban driveway. She watched herself hand a thick white envelope full of cash to the fake grief counselor she hired to declare me legally insane. She watched herself commit a massive federal felony right there in full color for everyone to see. I looked at her shaking body. I told her that she had exactly 24 hours to clear every single piece of equipment out of my commercial building. I told her that if she left so much as a single dirty towel behind, I would personally hand this digital video directly to the district attorney. I told her I would ensure she went to a federal penitentiary for bribery, fraud, and elder abuse. Chloe began to hyperventilate. She grabbed her chest as if she was having a heart attack. She took another step backward and hit the frosted glass wall of the boardroom. She realized that every single thing she had worked for was completely gone. Her lies were exposed. Her manipulation was utterly useless. She could not bat her eyelashes and flirt her way out of this room. She was trapped in a cage with a predator she had severely underestimated. She tried to apologize. She tried to say that she was desperate and that my son Derek had forced her to do it. She threw her own husband under the bus without a second thought. She said she never wanted to hurt Ruby. She said she was just terrified of losing her spa. I raised my hand and pointed toward the heavy mahogany doors. I told her that her time was up. I told her that every second she spent standing in my boardroom was a second she was wasting. I reminded her she only had 24 hours to pack up her pathetic fake life and disappear from my property forever. Chloe did not say another word. She turned around and ran. She left her designer purse and her scattered makeup on the floor of my boardroom. She pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and sprinted down the quiet corporate hallway. I could hear her stiletto heels clicking frantically against the marble floors. It was the sound of absolute sheer panic. She reached the private elevator and mashed the call button with her shaking hands. When the doors opened, she practically threw herself inside. She rode the elevator down to the lobby, sobbing uncontrollably. She ran past the security guards looking like a completely deranged woman. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess. Her expensive red dress was wrinkled. She ran out into the cold morning air of downtown Atlanta. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her cell phone. She was completely out of options. She had no business and no money. She knew Derek was bankrupt and facing federal indictments. Her only remaining lifeline was Brad, the wealthy white casino owner she had been sleeping with in Miami. The man she promised to run away with once she stole my pension. She dialed his private number with trembling fingers. She pressed the phone to her ear, praying he would answer and save her from this escalating nightmare. The phone rang once. Then it clicked. A cold, automated voice filled her ear. The voice stated that the number she was trying to reach had been permanently disconnected. Chloe froze in the middle of the busy sidewalk. She stared at her phone screen in total disbelief. She dialed the number again. She got the exact same automated message. Brad had blocked her. He had changed his number entirely. He knew that a woman with $400,000 in commercial debt and a looming federal fraud charge was a massive liability. Without her luxury spa and without the millions she promised to steal from my estate, Chloe was absolutely useless to a man like Brad. He discarded her the exact same way she planned to discard my son. Chloe collapsed onto a concrete bench at the bus stop. She buried her face in her hands and wept loudly in front of hundreds of passing strangers. She was entirely alone in the world. She had $400,000 in business debt attached to her personal Social Security number. Her spa was gone. Her secret lover had abandoned her. Her husband was ruined. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and a looming criminal investigation hanging over her head. Across town, the reality of my vengeance was crushing my son just as thoroughly. Derek did not go to federal prison. I kept my word. I paid the $150,000 directly to the federal courts as restitution for his defrauded investors. The prosecutors agreed to drop the felony wire fraud charges down to a minor misdemeanor. He walked away with his freedom, but that was the only thing he had left. He had signed the legal renunciation of inheritance. He was officially and permanently stripped of any future claim to the L&R Holdings empire. He was completely bankrupt. Derek had to sell his expensive clothes and his watches just to afford the security deposit on a tiny, cramped studio apartment in the worst part of the city. The apartment building was filthy. The walls were thin and the floors were infested with roaches. He had no college degree to fall back on because his entire reputation in the tech industry was completely destroyed. No corporate office would ever hire a man who was publicly investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission. My son, the man who used to wear Italian silk ties and drink expensive imported wine, was forced to take the only job that would hire him. He works the graveyard shift at a dirty 24-hour gas station right off the interstate highway. He spends his nights standing behind bulletproof glass wearing a cheap polyester uniform shirt. He rings up cheap cigarettes and stale coffee for truck drivers and insomniacs. Every single dollar he earns goes directly toward paying off the massive mountain of personal debt he accumulated while trying to live a fake billionaire lifestyle. He looks exhausted. He has lost weight. His hair is thinning from the profound, unrelenting stress of absolute poverty. He spends his nights staring out the dirty glass windows of the gas station, wondering how his life went so incredibly wrong. He remembers the days he spent plotting to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He remembers looking at his mother in the hospital bed and calculating how much money he could save by letting her pass away. Now he has to live with the agonizing knowledge that if he had just been a decent human being, he would have inherited a $40 million commercial real estate empire. He threw away a kingdom for a handful of dirty pennies. The irony is absolutely beautiful. It is the kind of profound poetic justice that you rarely ever get to see in the real world. Derek and Chloe spent their entire relationship looking down on the working class. They looked at my calloused hands and my cement-stained work boots with total disgust. They thought they were intellectually superior because they knew how to use fancy startup buzzwords and drink champagne at high society galas. They tried to discard me simply because of my age and my blue-collar background. They thought laying bricks was a job for simple-minded fools. But they completely forgot the most important rule of the physical world. The people who build the foundation are the only ones who truly know how to tear the building down. They were utterly destroyed by the exact same blue-collar grit they mocked. They were crushed by an empire built on sweat, early mornings, and calloused hands. They tried to play a ruthless game of chess against a man who built the board they were standing on. And now they get to spend the rest of their long, miserable lives living in the rubble of their own catastrophic mistakes. 6 months have passed since the night my world almost ended in that cold hospital waiting room. The violent storms of betrayal and greed are completely gone. The dust has finally settled over the city of Atlanta. Today the sun is shining brightly and the air smells like fresh blooming jasmine. I am walking down a quiet paved path surrounded by towering green trees and meticulously manicured flower beds. I am not alone anymore. I am pushing a comfortable wheelchair along the smooth concrete path. Sitting in that wheelchair is my beautiful wife, Ruby. The $150,000 experimental arterial surgery was an absolute and complete success. It took time and it took an incredible amount of patience, but she finally woke up. The color has completely returned to her warm brown skin. Her bright smile is just as radiant as the day I married her 40 years ago. Her cognitive function is perfectly intact. She remembers everything, and she is recovering beautifully. She is regaining her strength every single day. We are not in a cheap state-run facility. We are not in the dark, depressing ward my son tried to banish her to when he wanted to steal our suburban house. We are currently strolling through the lush, private gardens of the most exclusive, world-class rehabilitation center in the entire state of Georgia. The nurses here are the absolute best in their field. The physical therapists treat her like absolute royalty. The food is prepared by private chefs, and the medical equipment is state-of-the-art. Ruby thinks I spent my entire life savings to get her into this luxurious facility. She still does not know the full extent of the truth. She does not know that she is actually the co-owner of the ground she is rolling over. This premier medical rehabilitation center is not just a random high-end property. It is the absolute crown jewel of the L&R Holdings commercial real estate portfolio. I bought this massive facility 5 years ago and funded it entirely with the profits from my construction empire. The R in the company name stands for Ruby, and this entire medical fortress was built specifically to ensure that she would always be protected. She is healing in a sanctuary that we own. I push her wheelchair gently around a gentle curve in the garden path. The warm Georgia sun filters down through the thick green canopy of the ancient oak trees. Ruby points to a beautiful red cardinal landing on a nearby stone fountain. She laughs softly, and the sound is the greatest music I have ever heard in my entire life. As we continue down the quiet path, I see an old man sitting alone on a wooden bench beneath the largest oak tree in the garden. He is wearing a clean but simple faded suit. He has a wooden cane resting between his knees. He is sitting perfectly still with his eyes closed, enjoying the quiet morning breeze. I recognize him instantly. It is Malachi, the old 80-year-old preacher from the hospital waiting room, the silent stranger who overheard my son plotting my destruction, the man who dropped that crumpled piece of notebook paper into my lap and gave me the warning that saved my entire life. I lock the brakes on Ruby's wheelchair right next to a patch of bright yellow sunflowers. I tell her I will be right back. I walk slowly over to the wooden bench. I do not want to startle him. I stand in front of the bench and wait. Malachi slowly opens his eyes. He looks up at me. The same deep, silent understanding is still there in his old, wise eyes. He recognizes me immediately. He does not look surprised to see me walking the grounds of this elite private facility. He simply nods his head in a slow, respectful greeting. I reach out my rough, calloused hand. Malachi leans forward and takes it. His grip is firm and strong despite his age. I look him directly in the eyes. I do not use fancy words or long speeches. I just look at this old preacher, and I tell him thank you. I tell him that his small act of courage in that dark hospital hallway was the spark that ignited a massive fire of justice. I tell him that because he chose not to look the other way, my wife is alive, and my legacy is completely secure. Malachi just smiles, a quiet, knowing smile. He pats the back of my hand, releases his grip, and goes back to watching the birds in the garden. I turn around and walk back to my wife. I unlock the brakes on her wheelchair, and we continue our peaceful stroll through the sunlit garden. I look out over the beautiful manicured grounds and the massive modern medical buildings standing tall in the distance. I realize that people in this world make a lot of foolish assumptions. They see an old black man with gray hair and they automatically think age makes you weak. They see hands covered in cement dust and scars, and they think hard physical work makes you simple-minded. They think a blue-collar background means you are an easy target for manipulation and greed. But they always forget one very important thing about men who lay bricks and haul steel for 40 years. We know exactly how to build an empire from the dirt up. We know how to lay a foundation that cannot be cracked. And more importantly, we know exactly which load-bearing walls to knock out to bring a house crashing down entirely on the people who do not belong in it. The greatest lesson here is that true wealth is not measured by the car you drive or the designer clothes on your back. It is measured by the solid foundation of character you build over a lifetime. Greed will always blind you to the value of the people who actually love you, and arrogance will inevitably be your absolute downfall. Never mistake a person's quiet demeanor or calloused hands for weakness or stupidity. The people who built the world around you know exactly how it works. If you try to exploit their sacrifices for your own selfish gain, you will eventually find yourself buried entirely under the rubble of your own terrible choices. If you enjoyed this story of justice and believe that greed always gets exactly what it deserves, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.